welcome. Are you ready for some spine-tingling scary stories tonight? In this video, we'll explore terrifying horror tales and paranormal mysteries that will leave you on edge. Before we dive in, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more creepy bedtime stories and eerie adventures every week. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and let me know. Now sit back, relax to the sound of rain, and prepare yourself for a haunting story that starts in an attic filled with unsettling secrets. Story 1: The Haunted Attic Secrets of My Grandmother's Past. Cleaning out my grandmother's attic was never on my list of things to do. But after her passing, the responsibility fell on me to sift through her belongings, organize her life into neat piles, and uncover the memories hidden away in the shadows. The house I had visited so often as a child, once filled with the warmth of her cooking and the soothing hum of stories shared over tea, felt different, now heavy, as if it held more than just memories. The attic was the last place I wanted to start. It loomed above the house like a forgotten relic, the door creaking under the weight of time as I pushed it open. The stale air, thick with dust, made me pause, but I pressed on, climbing the narrow stairs that groaned beneath my feet. Boxes upon boxes lined the walls, piled high with faded linens, old clothes, and what seemed to be decades' worth of forgotten trinkets. I moved carefully through the clutter, sifting through what appeared to be random assortments of family heirlooms. Hours passed, and my fingers were coated in dust, my mind drifting in and out of the past. That's when I saw a small, weathered scrapbook tucked away under a pile of magazines. Its cover was frayed at the edges, the pages yellowed with age, but something about it made me pause. I flipped it open, expecting to find photos or notes, maybe something nostalgic from my grandmother's life. Instead, I was met with pages of newspaper clippings, articles detailing crimes from our small town. At first, I thought it was a collection of local history, nothing out of the ordinary. But as I flipped through, my pulse quickened. The first clipping was about a robbery from the 1960s, a small jewelry store hit by a local gang. The strange part was seeing my grandfather's name mentioned as a witness. It didn't sit right with me. My grandfather, a man who had always seemed so far removed from trouble, was directly involved. I frowned but continued to the next page, where the unease deepened. The second article was from the late 1970s, detailing a brutal murder that had shocked the town. A young woman's body had been discovered in the woods by hikers, her name unfamiliar to me. Yet, as I read further, I saw that one of the last people to see her alive was a relative, someone I'd grown up knowing but had never heard connected to anything like this. My stomach knotted. I turned the pages faster, uncovering more disturbing stories. There was an arson case involving a local business that had burned to the ground. The suspect? Another distant cousin. The charges were dropped due to lack of evidence, but the article hinted at something more sinister, whispers of family involvement that had been buried alongside the ruins. I felt my heart race as I pieced together the pattern. This wasn't just a collection of old news stories, this was a dark family history, one my grandmother had hidden away for decades. I kept reading, each article more chilling than the last. One described the mysterious disappearance of a neighbor in the 1990s. My jaw clenched as I read that one of my siblings had been quoted, seen arguing with the missing person just days before they vanished. Why had no one ever spoken about this? My mind raced, my thoughts spiraling as the weight of the scrapbook settled in my lap like a heavy burden. Then I found the final clipping, and it was the one that truly sent my heart into overdrive. It was a recent article, a story about a string of break-ins in our very neighborhood. The chilling part? Our family home was one of the targets. The photograph showed my relatives on the porch, smiling, unaware of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface. The article was sensationalist, full of speculation about who might be behind the crimes, but the connection to my family felt undeniable. Suddenly, the attic felt smaller, more oppressive. The walls seemed to close in on me, the weight of secrets pressing down. I needed to talk to someone, anyone who could explain this. I grabbed the scrapbook and hurried downstairs, the air feeling heavier with each step. As I drove to my mother's house, the images and words from the articles replayed in my mind. How could we not have known? What else was hidden in our family's past? My mother greeted me with her usual warmth, but the smile faded when she saw the look on my face. I wasted no time, pulling her into the living room and placing the scrapbook in front of her. She hesitated, her fingers trembling as she opened it. I watched her expression shift from curiosity to alarm as she read the first few clippings. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice strained. "In Grandma's attic," I replied, my tone tight. "Why didn't you ever tell me about any of this?" She sighed, her hands tracing the edge of the book. "Your grandmother. She had her secrets. There were things she didn't want to talk about. I didn't know everything either." "But why didn't you say anything?" I pressed. "How could you not tell me that a member of our family was involved in a murder, or that a cousin was suspected of arson?" She looked away, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't know all the details. I knew enough to understand that our family has a complicated history. People make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes, they have consequences. My frustration bubbled over. Consequences? This isn't just some mistake. Our family is tied to all of this in ways that feel deliberate. Why didn't we move on from this? My mother's gaze hardened. We thought we could. We thought burying the past would help us move forward. But maybe it was naive to think we could forget. I shook my head, anger rising in my chest. We can't just ignore this. What if there's more? What if it's not just history? She didn't answer, her eyes glued to the scrapbook, as if the pages held all the answers she was too afraid to confront. That night, I couldn't sleep. The attic felt like a looming presence in my mind, the weight of generations pressing down on me. I needed answers, and I was determined to find them. If the stories in the scrapbook were true and I had no reason to doubt them, then our family had a dark connection to this town, one that spanned decades. The next day, I decided to dig deeper. I drove to the local library, sifting through old records, piecing together the stories mentioned in the scrapbook. The more I uncovered, the more disturbing the connections became. It wasn't just my family, it was the town. A dark thread seemed to run through every major crime, and my family was tangled in it. As the weeks went by, I became obsessed. I tracked down people who had been involved in the cases, witnesses, old detectives, even some of the families of the victims. Each conversation led me deeper into the web, and I began to sense a pattern, a shadowy presence that loomed over the town's history. And then I discovered the most chilling connection of all. Many of the crimes had ties to a secret organization, one that my family had been part of for generations. It was a society that had operated in the shadows, rumored to have deep connections to the town's power structure. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that this wasn't just about my family's past, it was about the dark underbelly of the entire community. Armed with this newfound knowledge, I confronted my mother again. "Did you know about this?" I asked, placing the evidence in front of her. The secret society, the connections. It all makes sense now. Her silence was telling. I knew then that I had a choice to keep digging or to let the past stay buried. But I couldn't ignore the darkness that had been hidden for so long. I had to bring it to light, not just for my family, but for everyone affected by the shadows that loomed over our town. The attic may have held the physical evidence, but the true weight of our family's secrets was something far darker. And it was up to me to uncover it no matter the cost. Story 2, The Postcards of Shadows. It was an ordinary Tuesday when the first postcard arrived, a day like any other. I was sorting through the usual stack of bills and junk mail when I noticed something out of place. A postcard. It had a weathered vintage look, the kind you'd expect to find in an old second-hand bookstore, featuring a quaint seaside town. The view was familiar. It was the same town I had visited the previous summer. I turned the postcard over, feeling a strange sense of unease. The message was short and cryptic. The waves hold your secrets, but beware the tide. My brow furrowed. I didn't recognize the handwriting, and there was no signature, just the vague, unsettling message. I laughed it off, chalking it up to a prank or a misguided joke from a friend, but a seed of doubt had been planted. As the days turned into weeks, more postcards began to arrive. The second one came 2 weeks after the first. This one depicted a picturesque mountain trail, eerily familiar. It was where my brother and I had hiked the summer before. The message on the back read, "The shadows whisper your name. Trust no one." My heart pounded as I stared at the card, trying to brush off the growing paranoia. Who could be sending these? I showed the cards to my best friend, Lisa, hoping she could help me make sense of it. But she just laughed. "It's probably someone messing with you," she said, dismissing it as harmless fun. "People are weird like that. It's nothing to worry about." Despite her attempts to reassure me, a gnawing sense of dread had taken root deep inside me. A third postcard arrived the following week, this time featuring a photo of a small cafe where I used to spend my afternoons sketching. The note on the back chilled me to the core. "They are watching you." Panic began to creep into my daily life, a shadow that wrapped itself around my every thought. I started feeling hunted, as though someone was trailing my every step. My routines changed. I avoided going out alone, always looking over my shoulder. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The postcards came like clockwork after that, each one more disturbing than the last. Every card depicted a place I had visited: an old library, a local park, even the beach where I had spent a carefree day last summer. The messages were taunting, as if whoever was sending them knew every detail of my life. It felt personal, too personal. The mystery gnawed at me. I began keeping meticulous track of my movements, noting down where I went and who I saw. Could it be someone from my past? An old friend with a grudge? Or perhaps it was something much darker, more insidious. One evening, as I sat surrounded by the postcards, I spread them out on the coffee table and began to study them more carefully. There had to be a pattern. Each postcard seemed to mark a specific moment in my life, a map of my recent past. I began laying them out in chronological order, following the trail of places I had visited. What I discovered sent a chill down my spine. The postcards weren't just random, they formed a pattern, almost like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Each message seemed to guide me toward an unknown destination, as though I was being drawn into a game where I didn't know the rules. I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to confront this head on. The next postcard that arrived mentioned the library again. "Seek the truth," it said. So that's what I did. The library had been my sanctuary as a teenager, a place of refuge where I could lose myself in books and stories. As I walked through its familiar halls, the scent of old books and musty paper filled the air. But this time, the comfort I used to feel was laced with unease. I felt like I was being watched. I scanned the shelves, searching for anything or anyone out of place. Finally, in the section where I used to spend hours reading, I saw a postcard slip between the pages of a book one had loved as a teenager. My heart raced as I pulled it out. This one was different from the others. It was blank. No message, no signature. Just the same old postcard. It felt like a clue, but I didn't know how to decipher it. I tucked the card into my pocket and hurried home, my mind racing. Once there, I spread out all the postcards again, tracing the routes they had guided me along. The messages kept replaying in my mind, each one more haunting than the last. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was part of something much bigger, something I couldn't yet understand. The next morning, another postcard arrived. This one depicted the library itself. The message: "You found the first piece. Seek the truth." My hands trembled as I read it. Whoever was behind this knew exactly what I was doing. I was being watched, of that I was certain. I barely slept that night, my thoughts spinning with possibilities. I was determined to get to the bottom of this. The following day, I decided to return to the beach, the one where I had spent that peaceful summer day. Maybe there were more clues there. I arrived at the beach just as the sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the water. The waves crashed rhythmically against the shore, the salty air filling my lungs. Despite the beauty of the scene, I felt a strange pull, an urge to wade into the water, as if something was calling me. I walked along the shore, lost in thought, when I noticed something half buried in the sand, a small, weathered box. My heart raced as I knelt down to dig it out. It was a simple jewelry box, old and worn by the elements. I opened it carefully, revealing a collection of photographs and letters, all yellowed with age. As I sifted through the contents, a realization hit me. These were photos of me. Me and my brother at the cafe, my friends at the park, and even some strangers whose faces seemed vaguely familiar. The letters were addressed to me, written in the same handwriting as the postcards. My breath caught in my throat as I read the final note: "You are connected to a past you cannot remember. The shadows hold your truth, and only by uncovering them can you be free." Tears welled up in my eyes as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. This wasn't just about being watched. I was part of something much bigger, an intricate web of history and memory that I had been unaware of. The postcards, the photographs, the cryptic messages, they were all leading me to a truth I had long forgotten. But now, I was determined to uncover it, no matter what the cost. The shadows held my past, and I had to confront them to find my freedom. Story 3: The Forgotten Reunion. The family reunion was meant to be a joyous occasion, a gathering of relatives who hadn't seen each other in years. Laughter and the smell of grilled food filled the air as cousins, aunts, and uncles shared stories and memories. The expansive backyard of my Aunt Carla's house was the perfect setting, complete with freshly cut grass and picnic tables spread across the lawn. Among the familiar faces, one stood out: Ryan, my cousin, who had always been something of an enigma. He arrived late, slipping into the crowd with his usual quiet demeanor. His tall, lanky figure seemed more shadow than person, his presence barely noticed by the others. Despite his apparent calm, I could sense something was off. His eyes darted from group to group, not settling on anyone for long. There was a tension about him, subtle but undeniable. As the evening wore on, I noticed that Ryan had disappeared. At first, I shrugged it off, thinking he might be catching up with someone in a quiet corner, but as the hours passed, I started to worry. I asked around, but no one seemed to have seen him leave. The chill crept into the warm summer air as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. Something wasn't right. Determined to find him, I wandered toward the edge of the property where a dense forest bordered the backyard. The laughter of my family faded behind me as I ventured closer to the tree line. That's when I saw a faint flicker of movement among the trees. My heart raced as I stepped cautiously into the woods, the cool air prickling my skin. There, standing at the base of a large oak tree, was Ryan. His back was to me, and he was staring intently at something just beyond the trees, his posture rigid. I called out to him softly, but he didn't respond. Slowly, I approached, my unease growing with each step. "Ryan," I said again, my voice louder this time. He turned abruptly, his eyes wide and haunted. His expression sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't the carefree cousin I remembered. His face was pale, his features tense as though he had seen something he couldn't explain. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, his voice shaky. "What are you talking about?" I asked, confused. "What's going on?" He glanced nervously back toward the darkness between the trees. "There's something here, something watching us." I followed his gaze, but I saw nothing, just shadows cast by the fading light. My heart pounded in my chest as a sense of dread washed over me. "What do you mean, watching us?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ryan shook his head, his hands trembling at his sides. "I've been seeing it for weeks. It's always there, just out of sight, watching." I took a step closer to him, trying to understand. "Ryan, you're not making any sense. What is it? Who's watching you?" Before he could answer, a branch snapped behind us. We both froze. My breath caught in my throat as I turned slowly to face the direction of the sound. The shadows seemed to shift, as though something or someone was moving through them. I strained my eyes, trying to make out any shape or figure, but the forest was eerily still. "I told you," Ryan whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's been waiting for us." I grabbed his arm, panic rising in my chest. "We need to go. Now." But Ryan didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the darkness, his body rigid with fear. "I can't leave," he said, his voice hollow. "It won't let me." I tightened my grip on his arm, pulling him toward the house. "Yes, you can. We're leaving, together." He resisted at first, his feet rooted to the ground, but finally he relented, allowing me to drag him back toward the light of the reunion. The sounds of laughter and conversation slowly returned as we broke through the tree line, but the fear in Ryan's eyes hadn't faded. We rejoined the party, but something had shifted. The once festive atmosphere now felt tense, the shadows longer, the air heavier. I kept close to Ryan for the rest of the night, afraid to let him out of my sight. As the reunion wound down and guests began to leave, I noticed Ryan lingering by the edge of the yard, his eyes still darting nervously toward the woods. I approached him one last time before saying goodbye, hoping to get some answers. "What was that back there?" I asked quietly. "What were you talking about?" Ryan looked at me, his face pale and drawn. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," he whispered. "But there's something in those woods, something that's been waiting for us for a long time." I didn't know how to respond. A part of me wanted to dismiss his words as nonsense, but the fear in his eyes was too real to ignore. I left the reunion that night with a knot of unease in my stomach, Ryan's words echoing in my mind. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried calling Ryan, but his phone went straight to voicemail. Concerned, I decided to visit him at his apartment. But when I arrived, the building manager informed me that Ryan had moved out without a word to anyone. It was as though he had vanished. I never saw Ryan again after that night. His disappearance was a mystery, and no one seemed to have any answers. The family speculated about where he might have gone, but no one knew for sure. I often thought about that night in the woods, wondering what he had seen, what had terrified him so deeply. Years later, during a family gathering, my Aunt Carla mentioned something strange. She told me about an old legend tied to the woods behind her house, a story about a spirit that watched over the land, waiting for the right moment to take those it deemed worthy. It was then that I realized Ryan hadn't been imagining things. Whatever he had seen that night, it was real, and it was still out there, watching. Story 4, The Warning Call. It was a typical Tuesday evening, and I was enjoying a quiet dinner after a long day when my phone rang, breaking the peaceful atmosphere. I glanced at the screen and saw an unknown number. Normally I would have ignored it, but something compelled me to answer. "Hello," I said, still chewing my food. The voice on the other end was urgent, low, and strangely familiar. "Listen carefully. You need to cancel your plans for Saturday. Don't go to the event. I froze, dropping my fork. Confusion swirled in my mind. "Who is this?" I demanded, my heart beginning to race. The voice continued, now laced with a hint of panic. "Just trust me. You'll regret it if you geo. A chill ran down my spine. "Why should I trust you? Who are you?" I asked, the anxiety rising. There was a brief silence, and then the voice replied, heavy with gravity, "I'm you. From the future. My blood ran cold. The voice sounded like mine, distorted but recognizable. "You have to believe me. Something bad is going to happen if you geo. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Was this some kind of joke? My heart pounded in my chest. "This doesn't make any sense," I said, my voice shaking. "How do I know this isn't a prank?" The voice sighed, sounding tired, as if carrying the weight of too many regrets. "I wish it were a joke, but I can't give you specifics. Just know that if you go, it will change everything. Stay home. The line went dead before I could ask any more questions, leaving me holding the phone in stunned silence. A million thoughts ran through my head. Was this real? How could it be? My mind spun, trying to find a logical explanation, but deep down, a feeling of dread settled in. Over the next few days, I tried to brush it off. I shared the story with my best friend, Jamie, over coffee, hoping she could shed some light, or at least laugh it off with me. "It sounds like something out of a bad sci-fi movie," Jamie said, raising an eyebrow. "But honestly, if I were you, I'd reconsider going. What's the worst that could happen by staying home?" I forced a laugh, but her words only fueled my growing anxiety. I had been looking forward to the art exhibit for weeks. It was a chance to reconnect with friends, to enjoy a night out in the city. Could I really cancel based on some bizarre phone call? As Saturday approached, the unease I had been trying to ignore came back in full force. I spent the day vacillating between excitement and fear. The exhibit was supposed to be fun, a break from the monotony of work. But the warning echoed in my mind, refusing to let me enjoy the anticipation. I stood in front of my closet, staring at the outfit I had picked out for the night. Hours passed, and despite my growing doubts, I texted Jamie to confirm our plans. "Can't wait," she replied. "It's going to be amazing. Her excitement was contagious, and for a moment, I let the thrill of the night wash over me, pushing the warning to the back of my mind. But as I left my house, locking the door behind me, a strange feeling of foreboding settled in the pit of my stomach. The sky was overcast, a stark contrast to the vibrant evening I had envisioned. Shaking off the unease, I got into my car, determined to enjoy the night. The drive felt longer than usual, the traffic heavier. I turned on the radio, trying to distract myself from the unsettling feeling gnawing at me. When I finally arrived at the gallery, I was greeted by laughter and excitement. Friends were mingling, drinks in hand, the air buzzing with energy. I tried to join in, engaging in small talk and admiring the art on display, but the phone call loomed in the back of my mind, whispering doubts that echoed louder with every passing moment. I forced a smile, but I couldn't shake the nagging sense that something was wrong. As the evening unfolded, I found myself drawn to a painting in the corner of the gallery. It was a swirling mass of colors, evoking both joy and sorrow. I lost myself in it, the emotions it stirred within me making time slip away. Suddenly, a loud crash snapped me back to reality. Glass shattered and commotion erupted near the entrance. My heart leapt into my throat as I turned to see people scrambling, panic rippling through the crowd. "Get down," someone shouted, and in an instant, the atmosphere shifted from celebration to chaos. My pulse raced as instinct took over. I darted toward the back of the gallery, desperate to escape the throngs of people pushing past me. The weight of my earlier doubts pressed heavily on my chest, and suddenly the urgency of the warning hit me like a tidal wave. I made it outside, gasping for breath as I leaned against the wall. The cool night air hit my skin, but my mind was reeling from the chaos I had narrowly escaped. My phone buzzed, and I quickly dialed Jamie. "Are you okay?" I asked when she answered, my voice trembling with relief. "Yeah, I'm fine," she replied, still shaken. "What just happened?" "I don't know," I said, still breathless. "But I think I just realized how lucky we are, Dot." As we spoke, the realization washed over me the phone call wasn't just a strange coincidence. I had been warned, and because of that, I had escaped whatever disaster had unfolded inside. That night, as I drove home, a strange sense of closure settled over me. The warning, the chaos, it all began to make sense. I didn't know who or what had called me that evening, but I had learned a valuable lesson sometimes. It pays to trust your instincts, no matter how bizarre the circumstances. The phone call remained a mystery, but I would carry the experience with me, a reminder that life can change in an instant, and that sometimes listening to that inner voice can make all the difference. Story 5: The Night in the Attic. The night was quiet, as it often was in the sleepy neighborhood where I grew up. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a silver glow over the houses, their windows dark, signaling that everyone had settled in for the night. But my mind was far from restful. There had been too many strange occurrences over the past week, too many unexplained noises, strange feelings, and even odd behavior from my normally calm dog. Every evening felt charged, as if the air around my house was alive with something unseen. It all started when I began hearing the noises. They were faint at first, a soft creak here, a rustle there. I chalked it up to the house settling, an old building groaning under its own weight. But then the sounds grew more distinct, more deliberate. At night I would hear footsteps pacing above me, in the attic, slow and deliberate, as though someone or something was up there, waiting. I had tried to ignore it, hoping that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, or perhaps an animal that had found its way into the crawl spaces. But the noises continued, growing louder and more frequent as the nights went on. I wasn't the only one who noticed either. My dog, usually calm and lazy, had started growling at the ceiling, staring up at the attic door, as if sensing something I couldn't see. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. One night, after another series of unsettling creaks and thuds from the attic, I decided to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight, its beam slicing through the darkness, as I stood at the base of the attic stairs. My heart pounded in my chest, a steady rhythm that matched the thudding from above. The attic stairs creaked under my weight as I ascended. With every step, I felt the air grow colder, a stark contrast to the warmth of the house below. My breath clouded in front of me as I reached the top. I paused, gathering the courage to push open the old wooden door. It swung open with a groan, revealing the dark expanse of the attic. Boxes and old furniture were haphazardly piled around, shrouded in shadows that shifted in the dim light from my flashlight. For a few moments, everything was still. I scanned the room, looking for any sign of movement, but there was nothing out of place, just the eerie silence of the space above the house. Then I saw a flicker of movement in the far corner, a shadow that didn't belong to the jumble of old things piled there. My heart jumped into my throat as the shadow seemed to grow, slowly creeping along the floor, as if it had a life of its own. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The air around me seemed to thicken, as though the attic itself was holding its breath, waiting. The shadow moved closer, its edges shifting and swirling, and I could feel the temperature drop even further, the cold seeping into my bones. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get out of the house, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the shadow as it slowly approached. Suddenly, the shadow stopped, hovering just a few feet away from me. It shifted, forming a vague silhouette, and then it spoke a whisper that barely registered in the freezing air. "Help US ... The voice was faint, but it was enough to break the spell that had held me frozen in place. I stumbled backward, my heart racing as the shadow flickered and swirled, almost as though it were fading. My mind was racing. Was it a ghost? A spirit trapped in the attic? The thought sent a wave of dread crashing over me, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't here to harm me. Instead, it seemed desperate. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The shadow didn't answer. Instead, it began to fade, slowly retreating back into the darkness of the attic. I watched it disappear, my mind racing. The attic grew silent once more, the cold air lifting slightly as the presence faded. I stood there for what felt like hours, my heart still pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Finally, I turned and hurried back down the stairs, locking the attic door behind me, as though that would keep whatever was up there from coming back. My dog was waiting for me at the bottom, staring at me with wide, anxious eyes. He must have sensed it too. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house set me on edge. Every shadow seemed to shift and move in the corners of my vision, but the attic stayed silent. The next day, I couldn't get the events of the night before out of my mind. I decided to do some research on the house, hoping to find some explanation for what I had experienced. After hours of searching through old records, I finally found something, a newspaper article from the 1920s, detailing a tragedy that had occurred in the house long before I had moved in. A family had lived here, a mother, father, and 2 young children. One night, there had been a fire in the attic, and though the parents had managed to escape, the children were trapped inside. The article was vague on the details, but it was clear that the fire had consumed the attic before the children could be rescued. My blood ran cold as I read the final lines of the article. It described how, ever since the fire, residents of the house had reported strange occurrences, cold spots, footsteps in the attic, and shadows that seemed to move on their own. I realized, with a sinking feeling, that the shadow I had seen wasn't just a random spirit. It was the remnant of those children, trapped in the attic where they had perished. They had been trying to reach out, trying to communicate, to find someone who could help them move on. That night, I knew what I had to do. Armed with what I had learned, I prepared to return to the attic. This time I brought candles, salt, and a plan. If the spirits of the children were still trapped up there, I was determined to help them find peace. The attic was just as cold and dark as before when I climbed the stairs. The air was thick with tension as I lit the candles and arranged them in a circle in the center of the room. I whispered a prayer, calling on whatever spirits lingered to find peace, to move on from the place where they had been trapped for so long. For a moment, nothing happened. The attic was silent, the candles flickering in the cold air. But then, slowly, the temperature began to rise. I could feel the air grow lighter, the oppressive weight that had hung over the room lifting. And then I saw them, two small figures standing in the corner of the attic. They were faint, barely visible, but I could make out their faces, two children, a boy and a girl, staring at me with wide, sad eyes. I felt a wave of emotion wash over me as they slowly faded, their forms dissolving into the air. As the last remnants of the children disappeared, the attic fell silent. The cold was gone, replaced by a warmth that I hadn't felt in the house before. I knew in that moment that the spirits of the children had finally found peace. Story 6, the figure at the door. It all started one evening when I was relaxing on the couch after a long day at work. The house was quiet, and the sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the room. That's when I heard a soft knock at the door. At first, I thought it might be a neighbor or a package delivery, but when I opened the door, no one was there. The porch was empty, and the street beyond was eerily quiet. I stepped outside, scanning the surroundings for any sign of life. But there was nothing, just the stillness of the night settling in. I shrugged it off, figuring it was probably just a prank, and went back inside. The next night, the knocking came again right around the same time. Once again, I opened the door to find no one there. This time, however, a chill ran down my spine as I peered into the darkness. The streetlights flickered, and for a brief moment I thought I saw a shadow moving at the edge of my yard, but it disappeared before I could focus on it. I shut the door, locking it tightly, trying to shake off the creeping unease. Over the next few nights, the knocks continued, always around the same time, soft, insistent, as if whoever was knocking didn't want to be heard by anyone but me. I started to dread that time of evening, waiting with bated breath for the inevitable sound at the door. I never saw anyone, never caught a glimpse of the person or thing behind it, but the sensation that I was being watched was undeniable. After a week of this, I decided to set up a camera by the front door, hoping to catch the culprit in the act. That night, I sat in the living room, anxiously checking the footage from my phone, waiting for the knock that had become an unwelcome part of my nightly routine. Sure enough, just past midnight, the soft rapping came again. My heart pounded as I checked the live feed. At first, nothing appeared on the screen. The porch was empty, just as it had been every other night. But then, out of the corner of the camera's view, I saw a shadow, barely visible, standing just beyond the light's reach. It lingered for a moment, and then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the night. I couldn't sleep after that. My mind raced with questions: who or what was knocking at my door, and why? I checked the footage again the next morning, hoping to find more clues, but the shadow was barely a blur, too fleeting to make out any details. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I decided to stay up the next night, hiding by the window, watching the front door closely. As the clock struck midnight, I held my breath, waiting. The minutes ticked by, And just as I started to think that maybe the knocking wouldn't come, I heard it louder this time, more urgent. My heart leapt into my throat as I peeked out the window. There, standing at the edge of the porch, was a figure, a tall, dark silhouette that seemed to blend into the shadows around it. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, staring at the door. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling, and dialed 911, my voice shaking as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. They promised to send someone over, but by the time the police arrived, the figure was gone. They searched the yard, the street, even the nearby park, but found nothing. I felt a mix of frustration and fear. How could something so real vanish so completely? The next few nights were even worse. The figure returned each evening, always standing just out of reach, always knocking with that same eerie rhythm. It was as though it was playing some twisted game, knowing it was driving me closer to the edge. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything but the relentless knocking and the shadowy figure that haunted my nights. I started leaving the lights on, hoping it would deter whatever was lurking outside, but it didn't work. The figure seemed unfazed by the light, as if it thrived in the darkness, watching me with unseen eyes. Every time I opened the door, it was gone before I could confront it, leaving me feeling more helpless with each passing night. One evening, determined to face whatever was tormenting me, I waited by the door, holding my breath as the clock ticked closer to midnight. The knock came, just as expected, but this time I flung the door open without hesitation. There was no one there, but the air felt different, heavier, colder, like a presence lingered just out of sight. I stepped out onto the porch, my heart pounding in my ears, and for the first time I heard something else, a whisper, faint and unintelligible, drifting through the night air. I backed inside, slamming the door shut, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just some prank. Something was watching me, something that wasn't human. The final straw came a few nights later. I woke in the middle of the night to find the door wide open, the cold night air streaming in. My blood ran cold. I knew I had locked the door before bed. I always triple-checked it now. But there it was, standing open as if inviting the darkness inside. I called the police again, but just like before, they found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. But I knew better. I could feel that the figure wasn't just outside anymore. It was in the house, watching me, waiting. That was the last night I spent in the house. I packed my bags and left the next morning, unable to shake the feeling that something had followed me, that it would never stop until I was gone. Even now, months later, I still hear the knocking sometimes, late at night, as I lie in bed. I tell myself it's just the wind, just a memory playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know the truth. It's still out there, waiting. Story 7, The Voices in the Woods. It was late, well past midnight, when I woke up to the sound of faint whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees outside my window. But as I lay in bed, trying to drift back to sleep, the whispers grew louder. It sounded like several voices, all speaking at once, their words indistinct yet urgent. My pulse quickened as I realized the noise wasn't coming from inside the house, but from the woods just beyond my backyard. The woods had always held a certain mystery. Growing up, my friends and I would make up stories about ghosts and creatures lurking within the dense foliage, but I never thought much of it. Tonight, though, something felt different. The whispers were persistent, as though they were calling out to me. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The words were still jumbled, but one phrase stood out, clear as day, come closer, dot. A shiver ran down my spine. I tried to tell myself it was just a dream, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The sound was real. I threw the blankets off and stood by the window, peering out into the darkness. The trees swayed gently in the cool night air, their leaves rustling softly, but there was no sign of movement. Still, the whispers continued. For a moment, I considered waking my brother, who was sleeping in the room next to mine, but the thought of dragging him into whatever this was felt wrong. I grabbed a flashlight from my bedside table and slipped into my shoes. If I was going to figure out what was going on, I had to do it alone. As I stepped outside, the cool night air hit my skin, raising goosebumps along my arms. The whispers grew louder, though still faint, as though they were beckoning me deeper into the woods. My heart pounded in my chest, but curiosity pulled me forward. I crossed the backyard and stood at the edge of the tree line, flashlight in hand. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the path that led into the woods. Every instinct told me to turn back, to run inside and pretend I hadn't heard anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to know what was out there. I took a deep breath and stepped into the woods. The trees closed in around me, their branches intertwining above, blocking out the moonlight. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a breeze, but I still couldn't make out the words. My flashlight flickered for a moment, then steadied, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I followed the sound, pushing deeper into the woods, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of leaves underfoot. As I walked, I noticed that the air had grown colder, almost unnaturally so, as though I had stepped into a different world entirely. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I gripped the flashlight tighter, my heart pounding harder with every step. Then suddenly the whispers stopped. I froze, the silence around me even more unsettling than the voices had been. I turned in a slow circle, shining the flashlight around the trees, searching for any sign of movement. My breath caught in my throat as I spotted a figure, barely visible through the trees, standing just a few feet away. It was tall, its body shrouded in shadow. I couldn't make out any features, but I could feel its gaze on me, watching. I took a step back, my heart racing. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent, its presence oppressive and cold. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it someone from town playing a prank? Or was it something else, something not entirely human? Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot, frozen in place by fear and curiosity. Then, without warning, the figure turned and disappeared into the trees, moving so quickly it was almost as if it had never been there at all. I stood there, breathless, my mind struggling to process what I had just seen. The woods were still again, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. The whispers had vanished, leaving behind an eerie silence that weighed heavily on my chest. Slowly I backed away, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I didn't know what I had just encountered, but I knew I couldn't stay in the woods any longer. I turned and hurried back down the path, my heart pounding in my ears. When I finally reached the edge of the woods, I broke into a run, sprinting across the backyard and bursting through the back door, locking it behind me. I stood there in the dark kitchen, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing. What had I just seen? Who or what had been out there watching me, and why had the whispers stopped as soon as I had reached that figure? That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadowy figure standing among the trees, its presence looming over me like a dark cloud. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting for me to return. In the morning, I tried to tell myself it had all been a dream, a trick of the mind brought on by the late hour and the eerie atmosphere of the woods. But deep down, I knew it hadn't been. I knew I had seen something I wasn't meant to see. The whispers haven't returned since that night, but the memory of them lingers, haunting me. I still find myself glancing toward the woods whenever I'm in the backyard, half expecting to see the figure standing there, watching, waiting. I don't go into the woods anymore. Whatever is out there, I'm not ready to face it again. Story 8: The Mirror's Curse. It was the day my partner, Jamie, returned from an antique shop that everything began to change. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when the front door swung open with an unusual force. Jamie stepped in, eyes gleaming with excitement, cradling a large, ornate mirror wrapped in layers of burlap. "Look what I found," they exclaimed, their voice tinged with a strange fervor. The mirror was beautiful, with an intricate silver frame etched with swirling designs that seemed to dance under the light. But despite its allure, something about it made me uneasy. "Why a mirror?" I asked, trying to gauge Jamie's enthusiasm. "It spoke to me," Jamie replied, a gleam in their eye that set my heart racing. "I just had to bring it home, Dot." That night we hung the mirror in our living room, its reflective surface catching the soft glow of the lamps. Jamie stood in front of it for what felt like hours, tracing the ornate patterns with their fingers. I watched uneasily from the couch, sensing a shift in their demeanor. There was something almost obsessive about the way Jamie fixated on the mirror. Over the next few days, things only got stranger. Jamie became increasingly drawn to the mirror, spending hours gazing into it as if lost in a trance. At times, they would even talk softly to the reflection, as though having a conversation with someone or something unseen. I tried to intervene, asking if they were all right, but Jamie would brush me off, their eyes never leaving the glass. "It just has so much to tell me," they would say, their voice distant. As the days turned into weeks, I noticed more unsettling changes. Jamie began wearing vintage clothing, often rummaging through thrift shops to find outfits reminiscent of bygone eras. Their personalities shifted, becoming more enigmatic and withdrawn. Friends noticed it too, often commenting on how different Jamie seemed. One evening, I couldn't take it anymore. "I think you need to step away from that mirror," I said, trying to breach the growing divide between us. Jamie's expression darkened. "You don't understand," they replied, their voice low and intense. "It's a portal to something greater. You just need to trust me. My heart raced with concern. This was no longer just a quirky antique. It felt like it was taking Jamie away from me. That night, while Jamie was lost in front of the mirror again, I decided to investigate. I flipped through the old books we had about antiques, searching for any information about mirrors and their supposed properties. What I found sent shivers down my spine. According to folklore, mirrors were believed to hold the souls of the deceased, acting as portals between realms. Some were said to reflect not just images, but thoughts, desires, and even the shadows of one's soul. The next day, I confronted Jamie. "We need to get rid of the mirror," I insisted, desperation seeping into my voice. Jamie's expression twisted with anger. "You don't get it. It's part of me now," they hissed, stepping closer to the mirror as if to protect it. "I can't just throw it away, Dot." I felt helpless. The mirror was consuming Jamie, and nothing I said could change their mind. That night, after Jamie had fallen asleep, I crept into the living room, determined to uncover the mirror's secrets. As I leaned closer to the glass, its surface rippled like water, distorting my reflection. Faces flickered within the glass, lost souls trapped within. The air around me thickened, heavy with energy that was both inviting and terrifying. I felt a tug at my consciousness, a whisper of voices beckoning me closer. I stumbled back, my breath hitching in my throat. The mirror pulsed with a dark energy that seemed to feed off Jamie's spirit, and soon it would reach for me too. I needed to act fast. Gathering my courage, I rushed to the kitchen, grabbed a heavy cloth, and returned to the living room, intent on covering the mirror. But just as I raised the cloth, Jamie stirred in the other room, their voice echoing with a strange urgency. "Don't," they cried, rushing in. "You'll ruin everything." I hesitated, the tension in the air crackling around us. "Jamie, it's taking you away," I pleaded. "You have to fight IT. For a moment, their expressions softened, a flicker of recognition breaking through the haze. But then, the darkness returned, clouding their eyes. "I can't let you do this," Jamie said, their voice eerily calm. "It's my destiny. With a surge of fear, I swung the hammer down, shattering the mirror into 1,000 glittering shards. A deafening roar filled the room as the reflections twisted and writhed, like spirits being set free. I shielded my eyes from the flying glass, feeling the energy of the room shift violently. As the chaos settled, I dared to look. The mirror was reduced to a heap of fragments, and the air was heavy with silence. Jamie collapsed to the floor, their face pale and trembling. I rushed to their side, cradling them in my arms. "What happened?" Jamie whispered, confusion flooding their eyes. I held them tightly, relief washing over me. "You were lost, but I brought you back," I said, my voice thick with emotion. In the days that followed, Jamie slowly returned to their old self, free from the shadow that had loomed over us. The house felt lighter without the oppressive presence of the mirror. Though we never spoke of it again, I knew the mirror had left its mark on both of us. Yet, on quiet nights, I sometimes wondered if the mirror was truly gone or if the remnants of its magic still lingered, waiting for the next curious soul to uncover its dark legacy. Story 9: The Strange Neighbors. When I first moved into my new neighborhood, everything seemed perfect. Charming houses lined the streets. Well-kept lawns sparkled in the sunshine, and the neighbors were friendly, always ready with a wave or a smile. But there was one house, just a few doors down from mine, that stood out. It wasn't in disrepair, nor did it look abandoned, but something about it felt off. The windows were always dark, the curtains drawn tightly shut, and I never saw anyone coming or going. It wasn't long before I started noticing other things, odd things. At night, I'd hear strange noises coming from that direction. Soft at first, like distant murmurs, but growing louder as the hours wore on. The sounds were unsettling, like a mix of low voices and shuffling footsteps, as though someone or something was pacing inside the house. I tried to ignore it at first, but the noises became a nightly occurrence. One evening, as I sat on my porch enjoying the cool breeze, I noticed the neighbors across the street whispering to each other, glancing nervously toward the strange house. I couldn't resist asking what was going on. "That house," the older woman whispered, her voice barely audible. "There's something not right about it. No one knows who lives there. Her husband nodded solemnly. "We've lived here for 10 years, and not once have we seen anyone come in or out during the day. But at night, his voice trailed off, leaving an ominous silence. Curiosity piqued. I started paying closer attention to the house. During the day, it was completely silent, as if it were asleep. But at night, it came to life. The strange noises continued, and every now and then, I thought I could see shadows moving behind the curtains. It wasn't long before the rumors began circulating. People whispered about ghosts, spirits trapped inside, or even something darker, something malevolent. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I decided to do some digging. I started with the town records, hoping to find out who owned the house. What I discovered was unsettling. The house had changed ownership several times over the years, but none of the names were familiar to the locals. More disturbingly, none of the previous owners had stayed for more than a few months before vanishing without a trace. One evening, as I sat on my porch, the strange sounds coming from the house grew louder. I watched as the front door creaked open slowly, revealing nothing but darkness inside. My heart pounded in my chest as I squinted, trying to make out any figures in the doorway. But there was nothing, just the oppressive blackness of the house. Against my better judgment, I stood up and began walking toward it. The air seemed to grow colder the closer I got, and the strange sounds intensified, now resembling whispers calling out from within. I hesitated at the edge of the yard, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. But something compelled me forward. As I stepped onto the porch, the door slowly swung shut behind me, the sudden silence pressing down on me like a heavy weight. My breath came in shallow gasps as I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling. Just as I touched the cold metal, a shadowy figure appeared behind the curtain in the front window. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, and bolted back to my own house without looking back. That night, I barely slept, my mind racing with the possibilities of what could be lurking inside. The next morning, I awoke to find a note on my doorstep. It was written in shaky handwriting, the letters smudged and uneven. Stay away. The house is watching you. Story 10: The Dolls in the Attic. When I moved into my grandmother's old house, I expected to find relics of family history, old photographs, worn furniture, and perhaps a few forgotten toys. The house itself was steeped in memories, every corner filled with remnants of the past. But on a rainy afternoon, while sorting through the attic, I stumbled upon something far more unsettling: a collection of dolls neatly arranged on a dusty shelf. Each doll was crafted with eerie precision, their faces frozen in lifelike expressions. The clothing they wore seemed to reflect different eras, spanning decades. At first, I was fascinated. The dolls were beautiful in a haunting way, each one more intricate than the last. I leaned in closer to inspect them, their glassy eyes staring back blankly. But the longer I looked, the more uncomfortable I became. Then, it hit me: each doll bore an uncanny resemblance to someone from our town. I pulled one off the shelf, a porcelain doll with curly blonde hair, dressed in a floral dress. Her face, delicate yet haunting, struck a chord deep within me. I knew that face. It was Lily, a girl who had vanished 5 years ago, last seen playing outside in her yard. The resemblance was chilling. I placed the doll back on the shelf quickly, as if it were burning my hands. The more I examined the collection, the more familiar faces I saw. Another doll with dark pigtails looked just like Sarah, a girl who had disappeared last year. And there, on the far side of the shelf, was a doll that resembled Marcus, a young boy who had gone missing during a camping trip several summers ago. Each doll seemed to capture a moment of sorrow, a tragic story frozen in time. I hurried down the stairs, my heart racing, unable to shake the feeling that these dolls were more than just eerie coincidences. That night, I decided to dig deeper into the town's history and its many disappearances. I spent hours sifting through old newspapers and online articles, piecing together the details of each missing person. The connections were clear. Every child who had gone missing over the past several decades had one thing in common: they disappeared on the same date as the annual town fair. A chill settled over me as I remembered my grandmother's old stories about the fair, tales she used to tell me as a child. According to the folklore, the fair was a time when the veil between the living and the dead was at its thinnest. The stories claimed that spirits could cross over, taking with them those who were lost or forgotten. Driven by fear and curiosity, I returned to the attic the next day, determined to uncover the truth. Armed with a flashlight, I climbed the creaky stairs, the air thick with anticipation. As I stood in front of the shelf again, the doll's lifeless eyes seemed to follow me, their presence more oppressive than before. I reached for the doll that resembled Lily and held it up to the light. "What happened to you?" I whispered, half expecting an answer. But the doll remained silent, its expression frozen in time. Just then, I noticed a small, weathered notebook tucked behind the dolls. It was bound in fraying leather, and I felt a surge of dread as I opened it. Inside, written in my grandmother's neat script, were meticulous notes chronicling the lives of the missing children. Each entry described the day they disappeared, the circumstances surrounding their vanishing, and most disturbingly, details that were never made public. My heart raced as I flipped to the final entry, written just a few months before my grandmother's death. It described a girl named Emma, who had vanished the previous year. In the margins, my grandmother had scrawled a single, haunting sentence: "The dolls are a warning dot." I stared at the words, trying to make sense of it all. Were the dolls meant to be protectors, guardians of these lost children? Or were they representations of lives taken, souls trapped in porcelain bodies? The thought was too terrifying to contemplate. I hurried out of the attic, determined to get rid of the dolls, but the moment I reached the stairs, a deep voice echoed through the attic: "You cannot leave them, Dot." I froze, my pulse racing. Slowly I turned around, but the attic was empty. Yet the presence I felt was undeniable, like the weight of 1,000 eyes watching me. That night I couldn't sleep. The weight of the doll's gazes and the sinister words of the notebook haunted me. I knew I had to confront whatever darkness lingered in my grandmother's house, whatever force was tied to the dolls and the missing children. Over the next few days, I sought the help of a local historian and spiritual leader, hoping to cleanse the house and rid it of the dark energy that seemed to hang over the attic. They spoke of ancient rituals, protective symbols, and ways to break the ties between the dolls and the spirits they might represent. On the night of the full moon, we performed a cleansing ritual in the attic. Candles were lit, herbs were burned, and prayers were spoken. As the air grew heavy with energy, the dolls seemed to shift, their blank faces softening ever so slightly. Then, as we reached the climax of the ritual, the air in the attic turned icy cold. The dolls trembled on their shelves, and for a brief moment I saw something shadow swirling around the porcelain faces, as if the spirits of the children were finally being set free. When the ritual ended, the attic felt lighter, almost peaceful. The dolls no longer seemed like eerie statues watching my every move. Instead, they looked like relics of a past that had finally been put to rest. I buried the dolls the next day in a quiet corner of the woods behind the house. As I walked away, I felt a sense of closure, knowing that whatever darkness had once haunted my grandmother's attic was gone. Story 11, the music box melody of the unseen. Alyssa had always loved antiques, so when she stumbled upon an old music box at a small, dusty shop in town, she couldn't resist buying it. The box was small, with an intricate design etched into its wooden surface and a delicate brass crank on the side. It looked like it had once belonged to another time, another world. The shop owner was a frail old man with eyes that seemed to look right through her. As she paid for the music box, he gave her a strange look and said, "Be careful with that. Some things are better left unheard." Alyssa brushed off his words with a polite smile, chalking it up to an old man's superstitions. She brought the music box home and placed it on her dresser. That evening, as the sun set and darkness filled her room, she decided to wind it up and listen to its tune. She turned the crank slowly, hearing the gears inside click and whir. The lid of the music box opened, revealing a tiny, delicate ballerina that began to spin in time with the melody. The tune was soft and beautiful, a haunting lullaby that seemed to echo through the room. But as she listened, Alyssa felt a chill creep down her spine. There was something off about the melody, something hidden in the notes that she couldn't quite put her finger on. It was almost as if she could hear a whisper woven into the music, a voice so faint that it seemed to come from far away. She shook her head, telling herself she was imagining things, and closed the music box. The melody stopped abruptly, the ballerina frozen mid-twirl. But that night, as she lay in bed, the tune seemed to play on, echoing faintly in her mind, like a memory she couldn't shake. Around midnight, Alyssa awoke to a sound that made her blood run cold. The music box was playing on its own. She sat up in bed, staring at the dresser in the darkness. The box was open, the ballerina spinning slowly, and the tune was louder now, clearer, filling the room with its haunting melody. She climbed out of bed, her hands trembling as she reached for the box. As she did, the music stopped, and she noticed something strange: the ballerina's face. Its expression had changed. The once delicate, serene smile was now a twisted frown, and its eyes seemed to be looking directly at her. Alyssa slammed the lid shut, her heart pounding. "It's just a trick of the light," she whispered to herself, trying to calm down. "I'm just tired." But the next day, the melody stayed with her, playing over and over in her head, no matter how hard she tried to block it out. It was as if the music had sunk into her soul, embedding itself deep inside her mind. Determined to get to the bottom of this mystery, Alyssa called her friend Megan over. Megan was practical, not easily spooked, and always had a way of making sense of things that seemed impossible. "You're telling me it played on its own?" Megan asked, raising an eyebrow. "That's creepy, but it's probably just an old mechanism glitching out. Let's wind it up again and see what happens." Alyssa hesitated but agreed, turning the crank on the music box once more. The lid opened and the ballerina began to spin. But this time, as the music played, they both heard it clearly, a whisper, hidden beneath the melody, repeating the same words over and over. "Help me. Let me out." Megan's face turned pale. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Alyssa nodded, her voice trembling. "Yes, what is that?" The whisper grew louder, and suddenly the ballerina stopped spinning. Its head snapped toward them, its eyes wide and unblinking, a single tear painted on its porcelain cheek. The whisper turned into a soft sobbing, the voice now clear and full of sorrow. "She's trapped," the voice said, echoing from within the music box. "She's been trapped for so long." Megan jumped back, nearly knocking over the lamp. "What's in there, Alyssa? What is that thing?" Alyssa reached out to close the box, but the lid wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding it open, forcing her to keep listening. The melody twisted, warping into a darker tune, and the tiny ballerina's expression seemed to change again, becoming more desperate, more human. "Please," the voice begged, now louder, echoing in the room. "You have to help me. Before he comes." Alyssa's skin prickled with fear. "Before who comes?" she asked, her voice a whisper. And then the music stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, guttural laugh that seemed to shake the air around them. The lights in the room flickered, and the air grew cold, so cold that their breath misted in front of them. "He's here," the voice said, trembling with fear. "He's found me." The room plunged into darkness, and a shadow stretched across the wall tall, menacing, with a face that was nothing but darkness and two glowing eyes. The figure seemed to emerge from the music box itself, growing larger, filling the room with its presence. "You let her out," the shadow said in a voice that was more growl than words. "And now you will take her place." Alyssa and Megan stood frozen in place, their eyes wide with terror. The shadow's hands reached out, long and thin, like tendrils of smoke curling around the music box. The lid slammed shut with a loud snap, and the ballerina's tiny face turned toward Alyssa one last time. Its eyes were pleading, desperate. "Run," the ballerina's voice screamed, echoing in their minds. But before they could move, the shadow lunged at them, its dark form engulfing the room. Alyssa felt the cold grip of its fingers wrap around her wrist, pulling her toward the box. She struggled, kicking and screaming, but the pull was too strong, like a whirlpool dragging her under. Megan grabbed Alyssa's arm, trying to pull her back, but the shadow's grip was relentless. "I won't let you go," Megan shouted, tears streaming down her face. The shadow laughed, a low, hollow sound that echoed through the room. "It's too late," it said. "She's mine now." The music box began to glow with a strange, otherworldly light, its melody warping into a distorted scream. Alyssa's vision blurred, the world around her twisting, warping like a nightmare come to life. She saw the ballerina inside the box, its eyes now wide with terror, its mouth open in a silent scream. "Please, no," Alyssa cried, reaching out one last time. "Don't let him take me." And then, with a final deafening snap, the lid of the music box slammed shut. The light went out, the shadow vanished, and the room fell silent. Megan collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. She reached for the music box, her hands shaking, and slowly opened the lid. The ballerina was still there, its face serene once more, spinning in time with the soft, haunting melody. But something was different. The ballerina was no longer just a tiny figurine. It had Alyssa's face frozen in an expression of fear, its eyes wide and lifelike, staring up at Megan as if pleading for help. "Alyssa," Megan whispered, her voice breaking. "Oh my God, what happened to you?" The melody played on, soft and sweet, echoing through the silent room. And as Megan stared into the ballerina's eyes, she heard it a whisper, faint and distant, coming from the music box. "Help me. Let me out." But Megan knew that once you were inside, there was no way out. The next day, Megan took the music box back to the antique shop, desperate to find the old man who had sold it to Alyssa. But when she arrived, the shop was empty, abandoned, like it hadn't been used in years. The windows were covered in dust, and a sign on the door read "Closed forever." Megan left the music box on the doorstep, its haunting melody still playing faintly as she walked away. She knew she could never destroy it, never escape the music that called out from within. And late at night, when the world is quiet and still, she can still hear it, the soft notes of the music box playing in her dreams, echoing with Alyssa's voice, begging for release. But Megan knows the truth now. Some things are better left unheard. Story 12: The Face in the Mirror, Reflections of Fear. Natalie always felt uneasy around mirrors. There was something unsettling about the way they reflected her image, like they held more than just her reflection. It didn't help that the old house she had just moved into had a massive antique mirror in the hallway, its glass slightly tarnished, its ornate wooden frame covered in intricate carvings that seemed to twist and move when she wasn't looking directly at them. She had considered getting rid of it, but the mirror seemed to be a part of the house itself, too heavy and ancient to move easily. And so there it stayed, looming in the hallway like a silent sentinel, watching her every time she passed by. One evening, after a long day of unpacking, Natalie stood in front of the mirror, wiping off a smudge from the glass. As she did, she noticed something odd in the reflection, a faint shadow that seemed to flicker just behind her. She turned quickly, expecting to see someone there, but the hallway was empty. She laughed nervously, shaking her head. "It's just your imagination," she muttered to herself, forcing a smile. But when she looked back at the mirror, her smile faded. The shadow was gone, but her own reflection seemed different. Her eyes looked darker, almost hollow, and her expression was strained, like she was trying to hide something. Natalie backed away from the mirror, her heart beating a little faster. She told herself it was just the stress of moving into a new place, that she was tired and seeing things. She turned off the hallway light and headed to bed, trying to forget the strange reflection. But that night, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the mirror, about the shadow she had seen. It was as if the reflection had left a mark on her mind, a ghostly image that wouldn't go away. The next day, she decided to cover the mirror with a sheet. She didn't need to see her reflection every time she walked by, and it made her feel better to have it hidden. But as she draped the sheet over the mirror, she thought she saw a movement again, a flicker in the glass, like someone waving from the other side. Natalie stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. "It's nothing," she whispered, more to convince herself than anything else. "Just my imagination." That night, as she lay in bed, a faint sound reached her ears, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails gently tapping on glass. She sat up, her eyes wide in the darkness, listening. The sound was coming from the hallway from the mirror. She grabbed her phone, using its flashlight as she stepped out into the hall. The sheet she had placed over the mirror was moving, rippling slightly as if touched by an unseen hand. Her stomach twisted in fear, but she forced herself to step closer, reaching out to pull the sheet away. When she did, the mirror was clear again, just a reflection of the empty hallway. She let out a shaky breath, feeling foolish for getting so worked up. But then, as she turned to go back to bed, something in the mirror's reflection made her stop cold. Her reflection wasn't moving. Natalie stood frozen in place, staring at the mirror. Her reflection was facing her, but it wasn't copying her movements. It was just standing there, staring at her with a twisted grin that didn't belong to her face. What the Natalie whispered, reaching out a trembling hand toward the mirror. The moment her fingers touched the glass, her reflection's grin widened. Its eyes, once hollow, now glowed with a cold light, like twin orbs of darkness. And then the reflection spoke. "You can't hide from me," it said in a voice that sounded almost like her own, but warped, twisted. "I've been waiting for so long, to be free." Natalie yanked her hand back, stumbling away from the mirror, her mind racing. She turned and ran down the hallway, slamming her bedroom door behind her. She pressed her back against the door, breathing heavily, trying to convince herself that it was all just a nightmare, a trick of the mind. But then, from the other side of the door, she heard it, a soft whispering voice, like a cold breeze brushing against the wood. "Let me out, Natalie," the voice said, its tone dripping with malice. "You're the one who called me." The next morning, Natalie was ready to call a friend for help, anyone who could tell her she wasn't losing her mind. She dialed her friend Laura, explaining everything in a rush. "You've got to come over," Natalie said, her voice cracking. Something's wrong with this mirror. It's like there's something inside it. Laura arrived within the hour, armed with skepticism and a flashlight. "All right, show me this haunted mirror," she said, trying to sound calm but glancing nervously at the covered glass. Natalie pulled the sheet off the mirror, holding her breath. For a moment, everything seemed normal. The reflection showed nothing but the two of them standing in the hallway. Laura laughed, shaking her head. "See? It's just a mirror, Nat. You're imagining things." But as she said those words, the lights flickered, and in that split second of darkness, they both saw Natalie's reflection wasn't standing with them anymore. It was behind Laura, grinning that twisted grin. "Laura," moved, Natalie screamed, but it was too late. Laura turned around, and the lights came back on. The reflection had returned to its place, its smile gone, replaced by a look of cold indifference. But something had changed in the room, a chill, like the air itself had turned to ice. "What the hell was that?" Laura whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "I saw it, Natalie. I saw it move." Natalie nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "It's trying to get out," she said, her voice trembling. "It wants to take my place." Desperate, they tried to cover the mirror again, but the sheet kept slipping off, as if an invisible hand was pulling it away. The reflection watched them, its eyes following their every move, its grin returning, wider than ever. "You can't cover me up," the reflection taunted. "I'm here to stay." The lights flickered again, and this time the reflection didn't just grin, it stepped forward. Its hands reached out from the mirror, its fingers long and twisted, pressing against the glass from the inside. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and then it cracked, a web of fractures spreading from where its fingers touched. "You can't stop me," it hissed, its voice echoing through the room. "I'm your true self, the one you hide." Natalie and Laura backed away, but the mirror's cracks continued to spread, dark lines snaking across its surface like veins. The reflection was no longer just a reflection, it was alive, breaking free from the glass, its eyes now black voids that seemed to pull in the light around them. With a final shudder, the mirror shattered, pieces of glass flying across the room. But the reflection didn't vanish. It stepped out of the mirror, its form now solid, its twisted grin splitting its face in two. "You've let me out," it said, its voice filled with triumph. "Now, you will take my place." Before Natalie could react, the reflection lunged at her, its hands cold as ice, wrapping around her wrists. She felt a force pulling her backward into the broken shards of the mirror, as if the glass itself was swallowing her whole. She looked up at Laura, her eyes wide with terror. "Help me," Natalie screamed. "Don't let it take me." But Laura was frozen in place, her face pale with shock. She watched in horror as Natalie's body was pulled into the mirror, her scream fading into a hollow echo. The glass reformed around her, sealing her inside. Natalie's reflection was now on the outside, standing with Laura, its grin replaced by a calm smile. It turned to Laura, its eyes filled with a twisted kind of joy. "Thank you for setting me free," it said softly. "I've waited so long for this." Laura stumbled back, tears streaming down her face. "What are you?" she whispered. "I'm her," the reflection said simply. "I'm everything she hides from the world. And now, I'm in control." It turned and walked away, leaving Laura staring at the mirror. Inside the glass, Natalie's face was still visible, her hands pressed against the surface, her eyes wide with terror. She was trapped, her silent scream frozen in time. The reflection paused at the door and looked back at Laura, that twisted grin spreading across its face once more. "Don't worry," it said. "She's safe in there." And now, the real fun begins. With that, it turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Laura alone with the shattered pieces of the mirror. And as she looked into the shards, she could still see Natalie's eyes staring back at her, begging for help from the other side. But there was nothing Laura could do. Natalie was gone, lost in the world of reflections, replaced by a version of herself she never wanted to meet. And even now, in the dead of night, Laura can still hear the faint sound of tapping on glass, echoing from the broken mirror. A voice that whispers, "Let me out." Torrey 13, the key that didn't fit unlocking the unknown. Jason had always been fascinated by mysteries, the kind of puzzles that required thinking outside the box. So, when he found a strange old key at a yard sale, he couldn't resist buying it. The key was heavy, made of tarnished brass, with an ornate design on the handle that seemed to twist into patterns he couldn't quite decipher. There was something about it that felt important, like it was waiting to unlock something forgotten. The woman who sold it to him gave him a knowing smile and said, "That key doesn't belong to any door you know." She said it in a tone that was both teasing and foreboding, making the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Jason laughed it off, thinking she was just trying to add some drama to the sale. He took the key home and placed it on the small table in his hallway, intending to add it to his collection of oddities. But later that night, he noticed something strange when he passed by the table. The key seemed to glow faintly, a soft, eerie light emanating from the metal. He rubbed his eyes, chalking it up to exhaustion, and went to bed. That night, Jason woke up to a sound of faint scratching, like metal scraping against wood. He sat up in bed, listening. The noise was coming from the hallway, from where he had left the key. He grabbed his flashlight and slowly crept toward the table. The key was lying there, just as he'd left it, but now there were deep scratches on the wooden surface underneath it, as if it had been moving on its own. He picked up the key, examining it closely. The ornate design on the handle seemed to twist and move under his fingers, almost alive. A chill ran down his spine as he felt the cold metal pulse slightly in his hand, as if it was reacting to his touch. Then he noticed something else, a number etched faintly into the metal. The number 13. Maybe it belongs to an old lock, Jason muttered to himself, trying to rationalize what he was seeing. But deep down, he knew that this was no ordinary key. The next day, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that the key was calling to him. He spent hours searching his house, testing every lock, every door, but the key didn't fit anywhere. Frustrated, he sat on the floor, staring at the number 13 etched into the key, wondering what it could mean. That evening, as he was locking up for the night, he noticed a small door at the back of his basement he had never really paid attention to. It was old, almost hidden behind a stack of boxes, and seemed to have been there for decades. He felt a strange pull toward it, like he was supposed to find it, like the key had led him there. He knelt down and inserted the key into the lock. To his surprise, it fit perfectly. He hesitated for a moment, a shiver of anticipation running through him, and then he turned the key. The lock clicked, and the door swung open with a slow, creaking groan. Beyond the door was a small, dark room, colder than the rest of the basement. The air inside felt heavy, like it hadn't been disturbed in a long time. Jason stepped inside, his flashlight revealing dusty shelves filled with old books, strange trinkets, and a large mirror covered with a tattered cloth in the corner. As he approached the mirror, he felt the temperature in the room drop even more. He hesitated, his hand trembling slightly as he reached out and pulled the cloth away. The mirror's surface was cracked, its reflection distorted. But what caught his eye was the writing scrawled across the glass, backwards as if written from inside. "Do not let him out, Dot." Jason's heart skipped a beat. He turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. He ran to the door, yanking on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The key he had used was no longer in the lock, it had vanished. A low growl echoed through the small room, and he spun around to see the mirror beginning to ripple like water. A dark shape was moving within the glass, its eyes glowing a deep, unnatural red. Jason's breath hitched in his throat as the shape grew larger, forming into a shadowy figure with elongated limbs and a face that seemed to blur in and out of focus. "You set me free," the figure said, its voice a deep rumble that seemed to come from the very walls. "You turned the key." Jason backed away, his mind racing. "I didn't mean to," he shouted. "I was just curious, I didn't know." The figure's grin widened, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "Curiosity comes with a price," it said, stepping closer, its eyes never leaving Jason's. "And now you will pay." He turned and banged on the door, screaming for help, but the walls seemed to absorb his cries, the sound swallowed by the oppressive darkness of the room. He could feel the cold fingers of the shadowy figure reaching out, brushing against the back of his neck, sending a jolt of fear through his entire body. Desperate, Jason grabbed a piece of wood from the floor and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered into 1,000 pieces, each shard reflecting the twisted grin of the creature. But the moment the mirror broke, the shadowy figure didn't disappear. It emerged from the fragments, fully formed, its smile now a cruel sneer. "You think breaking the glass can trap me?" it taunted, its voice echoing through the small space. "I'm no longer bound by this world or the next." The creature lunged at Jason, its cold, inky tendrils wrapping around his arms, dragging him toward the broken shards of the mirror. He struggled, kicking and thrashing, but the force was too strong, too overwhelming. The broken pieces of the mirror began to reform around him, encasing him in a prison of glass. "You unlocked the door," the creature said, its voice now soft and mocking. "And now you'll take my place." Jason's vision blurred as the mirror closed in around him, trapping him inside. He looked out through the cracked glass, seeing his own terrified face staring back at him, but with eyes that were not his own. They were the eyes of the shadowy creature, filled with malice and darkness. "No," Jason screamed, his voice muffled by the glass. "Please, let me out." The creature's grin widened as it stood on the other side, now in Jason's form, its eyes filled with twisted glee. It picked up the key from the floor and placed it in its pocket, turning to face the world beyond the small room. "Thank you for setting me free," it said, its voice now perfectly mimicking Jason's. "I've been trapped in that mirror for so long." Jason pounded on the inside of the glass, his fists hitting the mirror's surface, but no one could hear him. He was locked inside, a prisoner in his own reflection, watching as the creature that now wore his face left the room and walked into his life. The door to the basement swung open with ease, and the creature, now indistinguishable from Jason, smiled to itself as it stepped into the light. The old key dangled from its pocket, the number 13 shining in the dim light, a reminder of the lock that should never have been opened. And as it disappeared into the world outside, the last thing Jason saw through the mirror's fractured surface was his own face, twisted in a silent scream, forever trapped in the darkness of the glass. The next day, when friends and family came looking for Jason, they found the basement door sealed tight. No key would fit, no tool could force it open. They called his name, searched the house, but there was no trace of him. and the mirror in the small, dark room remained silent, its surface cracked, reflecting only the empty room. But if you looked closely, just for a moment, you might see something, a face staring back at you, eyes wide with terror, pleading for help from the other side of the glass. A face that looked just like Jason's. Story 14, the book that wrote itself words of darkness. Claire loved books more than anything. They were her escape from reality, her comfort when life got too overwhelming. So when she stumbled upon a dusty, leather-bound book in an old bookstore hidden down a narrow alley, she couldn't resist buying it. The cover was blank, the leather worn and cracked, but something about the weight of it in her hands felt important, like it was waiting for her to discover its secrets. The shop owner, a frail woman with sharp eyes, gave Claire a peculiar look as she handed over the money. "That book is not like the others," the woman said quietly. "It writes itself. It shows you what it wants you to see." Claire laughed nervously, dismissing the warning as nothing more than a quirky sales pitch. She thanked the woman and carried the book home, excited to read her new find. But when she sat down and opened the cover, her excitement turned to confusion. The pages were blank, every single one of them, except for the first, which contained a single sentence scrawled in elegant handwriting. "This book is yours to finish. Claire stared at the words, puzzled. She thought it must be some kind of journal or a creative writing exercise. She decided to play along, picking up a pen to write her name on the first page. But as soon as her pen touched the paper, the ink spread across the page in swirling patterns, forming words that she hadn't written. "Hello, Claire," the words read. "I've been waiting for you. She dropped the pen, her hand trembling. "What the?" she muttered, staring at the book. The words on the page seemed to pulse slightly, like they were alive, like they were watching her. Trying to shake off the unease, Claire closed the book and set it aside. She told herself that it must have been a clever trick, a reactive ink that appeared when it came into contact with pressure. But even as she walked away, she felt like the book's words were burned into her mind. Later that night, Claire couldn't resist the urge to open the book again. When she did, the words on the page had changed. New sentences had appeared, describing her in eerie detail the clothes she was wearing, the way she'd nervously tucked her hair behind her ear, the very words she had muttered to herself. "What is this?" Claire whispered, her voice shaky. "How does it know?" The book seemed to respond, ink bleeding onto the next blank page, writing itself as she watched in horror. "You are the one I've been waiting for," it wrote. "You will write the story with M.E. Claire slammed the book shut and threw it across the room, her heart pounding. It lay there on the floor, its cover innocently closed, as if nothing had happened. She knew she should get rid of it, burn it, but something in her felt tethered to the book, like it held a piece of her she couldn't let go. The following day, Claire tried to ignore the book entirely. She buried herself in work, met up with friends, did everything she could to keep her mind off it. But when she returned home that evening, the book was no longer where she'd left it. It was sitting on her desk, open, waiting for her. Curiosity and dread warred within her, but she felt compelled to read what was written on the new page. The words were more sinister now, their tone darker. "You cannot run from me, Claire," it said. "I know your fears. I know your secrets. And soon, everyone else will know them too. As the ink continued to spread across the page, Claire saw her worst memories appearing in the book, moments she had never spoken of, things she had tried to bury deep inside. The book was revealing her past, her regrets, the darkest corners of her soul. She could see the betrayal in the eyes of her best friend, the lies she had told, the guilt that gnawed at her every day. "Stop it," Claire screamed. slamming the book shut. "You have no right." But when she looked at her hands, she saw ink stains on her fingers, as if she had written those words herself. The ink spread up her arms like veins of darkness seeping into her skin. Panicked, Claire grabbed her phone and called her friend Emily, her voice trembling as she explained what was happening. "Please, you have to come over," she begged. "This book, it's doing something to me. I think it's alive." Emily arrived quickly, her face filled with concern. "Claire, are you okay?" she asked. "Where's this book you're talking about?" Claire pointed to the desk where she had left the book, but it wasn't there. It was now lying open on her bed, the pages fluttering like they were caught in a breeze. Emily cautiously approached it, peering down at the text. What the Emily whispered, her eyes widening. "It's writing something." They both watched in horror as new words appeared on the page, the ink bleeding through as if an unseen hand was scrawling them. "You shouldn't have called her," the book wrote. "Now, she's part of the story too. The lights in the room flickered, and suddenly the air grew colder, the temperature dropping so quickly that their breath turned to mist. The book's pages started turning on their own, faster and faster, whipping back and forth like they were alive. Claire tried to shut the book, but the pages refused to close. The words on the pages shifted, rearranging themselves into a single command. "Finish the story. The room plunged into darkness, and in the faint light from the hallway, Claire saw a shadow rising from the book, a figure taking shape, its face twisted into a cruel smile. It reached out with long, inky fingers, grasping for her. "Run!" Emily screamed, pulling her toward the door. But the shadow was faster. It grabbed Claire by the wrist, its touch cold as ice, pulling her back toward the book. She felt her feet leaving the ground, the room spinning around her, as if she was being sucked into the pages themselves. "No," Claire shouted, struggling against its grip. "Let me go." The book's voice echoed through the room, a hollow laugh that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You started this," it taunted, "and now you will never leave. Emily reached for Claire's other hand, her grip slipping as the shadow's pull grew stronger. The book's pages wrapped around Claire like tendrils, pulling her down into its depths. She could feel the cold ink seeping into her skin, merging with her, binding her to the words. "Don't let go," Claire cried, tears streaming down her face. "Please don't let it take me." Emily tried to hold on, but the force was too strong. With a final, desperate scream, Claire was pulled into the book, the pages slamming shut behind her. The room fell silent, the air still, as if nothing had ever happened. Emily stood there, staring at the closed book, her hands shaking. She reached out, hesitating, then slowly opened the cover. The first page was no longer blank. It was filled with words, new words, written in Claire's handwriting. "I am trapped inside," it read. "The book is alive. It's rewriting me. Emily's eyes filled with horror as she saw Claire's face staring up at her from the page, her expression twisted in fear, her mouth open in a silent scream. "No," Emily whispered, backing away. "This can't be real." But the book's pages turned again, and new words appeared, as if the story was still being written. "The story never ends," it wrote. "Your next dot." Emily dropped the book, running out of the room, but she knew she could never truly escape. Somewhere, in the quiet of the night, she would always hear the soft rustle of pages turning, the whisper of ink bleeding onto the paper. And she knew that as long as the book existed, Claire's story would continue to write itself, drawing others into its darkness. The book waits, its blank pages eager to be filled. It's only a matter of time. Story 15, the figure in the window, eyes that never leave. Jake had always loved the peacefulness of living in the countryside. His new house was perfect, isolated, surrounded by trees, with large windows that looked out over a quiet meadow. It was exactly the kind of place where he could relax and clear his mind. But from the first night he moved in, something felt off. It started when he was unpacking boxes in the living room. As the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the sky a deep shade of purple, Jake glanced out the window. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a figure standing at the edge of the meadow, just barely visible in the fading light. He blinked, and it was gone. Just a trick of the shadows, he muttered to himself, shaking off the unease. He closed the blinds, telling himself he was just tired from the move. But even as he turned away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. That night, as Jake lay in bed, he woke up suddenly, his senses on high alert. He didn't know what had woken him, but the room felt different, colder, like a chill had settled in. He got up, his eyes drawn to the large window that faced the meadow. He hesitated, then pulled back the curtain, his breath fogging up the glass. And there it was. A figure stood in the darkness, just beyond the reach of the porch light. It was tall, its outline blurry, like it was cloaked in shadows. Jake's pulse quickened, and he squinted, trying to make out any details, but the figure seemed to blur and shift, like smoke in the wind. "Who's out there?" Jake called, his voice cracking slightly. "Who are you?" The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching him, its head tilted slightly to the side. Jake closed the curtain quickly, his hands shaking. He grabbed his phone and called the local police, explaining that there was someone outside his house. When the police arrived, they searched the property thoroughly. They found no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. The officer gave Jake a skeptical look and said, "Are you sure it wasn't just an animal or something? Maybe a trick of the light?" Jake nodded reluctantly, even though he knew what he'd seen wasn't a trick. He thanked the officer and locked all the doors and windows, trying to convince himself that it was nothing. But deep down, he knew it wasn't over. The next few days passed without incident, and Jake started to relax. He told himself that maybe it really had been a trick of the light, or maybe he was just tired from the move. But then, one evening, as he sat in his living room, he felt that familiar chill again. He turned his head slowly toward the window. The figure was back. This time it was closer, standing just outside the window, its face still obscured in shadow. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He reached for the lamp, switching it on, and the light flooded the room. But the figure didn't vanish. It stood there, staring in, its eyes glinting like two cold stars. He bolted to the window, flinging it open. "What do you want?" he shouted. "Leave me alone." But the moment the window opened, the figure disappeared, melting into the darkness. There was no sound, no movement, just silence, as if it had never been there at all. Jake slammed the window shut, drawing the blinds tight, his mind racing. He called his friend Mark, explaining everything in a rush. "You have to come over," Jake said, his voice shaking. "I'm not going crazy, there's someone out there." Mark arrived within the hour, armed with a flashlight and a skeptical expression. "All right, show me where you saw this figure," Mark said, his eyes darting around the property. Jake led him to the window, pointing to the spot where the figure had been. "It was right there," he insisted. "I swear it was watching me." Mark shone the flashlight into the darkness, sweeping it across the meadow. "There's nothing out here," Jakey said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Wait," Jake said, pointing toward a tree at the edge of the property. Do you see that?" They both stared as the flashlight beam landed on the base of the tree. There, carved into the bark, were deep gouges marks that formed the outline of a face. Two eyes and a twisted smile stared back at them, almost like the tree itself was grinning. "What the hell is that?" Mark whispered, stepping back. Jake's stomach twisted in fear. "It's been watching me," he said, barely above a whisper. "It's marking its territory." That night, Jake couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the figure's outline, the twisted grin carved into the tree. He got up to check the windows for the 10th time, making sure they were locked, when he felt a cold breath on his neck. He turned around slowly, dreading what he might see. The figure was inside the house. It stood in the middle of the living room, its face still hidden in darkness, but now it was more solid, more real. Jake's breath came in short gasps as he stared at it, unable to move. "Get out," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Get out of my house." The figure's head tilted, and then it moved slowly, almost gliding toward him. Its eyes were visible now, gleaming like twin points of light in the darkness, its smile wide and knowing. "You invited me in," it said in a voice that sounded like dry leaves rustling. "And now I'm here to stay." Jake ran for the front door, but the moment he touched the doorknob, it froze under his hand. The entire house seemed to shift, the walls closing in, the windows darkening as if they were covered by a thick fog. The figure was suddenly in front of him, its cold hand reaching out to touch his face. "You belong to me now," it said, its voice echoing in his mind. Jake felt the world spinning, the air around him growing thin. He stumbled backward, falling to the floor, his eyes locked on the figure's twisted smile. It reached down, its face inches from his, and he finally saw it clearly. It was his own face. The face was a distorted, nightmare version of himself, its eyes empty black pits, its mouth stretched into a grin that was too wide, too sharp. The figure leaned closer, whispering in his ear. "You let me in," it said softly. "You can never leave." With a final surge of desperation, Jake reached for the lamp beside him, smashing it against the figure. The light shattered, plunging the room into darkness, and for a moment everything was still. When the lights flickered back on, the figure was gone. Jake sat up, gasping for breath, staring at the empty space in front of him. He thought it was over, that he'd somehow driven it away. But then he looked at the window. The figure was back, its face pressed against the glass, grinning that awful smile, its eyes locked onto his. And in the reflection, Jake saw something that made his blood run cold. His own face wasn't his anymore. It was the twisted face of the figure, staring back at him with eyes full of darkness. "No," Jake whispered, shaking his head. "This isn't real." The reflection's mouth moved, and he heard its voice in his head, mocking him. "You're mine now," it said, "and every time you look in the mirror, you'll see me." The figure disappeared from the window, but Jake knew it was still there, watching him from the shadows. He could feel its presence in every dark corner, in every flicker of the light. The next day, Jake tried to leave the house, but no matter how far he drove, no matter where he went, he couldn't escape. He would look into any reflective surface, a window, a mirror, even the water in a puddle, and there it was. His own face, twisted into that same smile, staring back at him. And he knew that no matter where he went, no matter how far he ran, he would never be alone. The figure would always be there, waiting in the darkness, just behind the glass. Watching, smiling, waiting for him to look. Story 11: The Watcher in the Hallway, a presence you can't escape. Sam always prided himself on being a logical person. He was the kind of guy who needed proof, evidence, something concrete before he'd believe in anything remotely supernatural. So when he moved into his new apartment in an old building on the outskirts of town, He didn't think twice about the rumors. People said the place was haunted, that strange things happened in the hallways at night. Sam just laughed it off, chalking it up to local ghost stories designed to spook newcomers. The apartment itself was perfect, small but comfortable, with a long, narrow hallway that led from the front door to the living room. The hallway had a series of old photographs lining the walls, images of the building from decades past, its former tenants staring out in black and white silence. Sam found them oddly charming, a nod to the building's history. But as the days passed, he started to notice something strange. It wasn't anything he could put his finger on at first, just a feeling like he wasn't alone. Sometimes, when he was walking down the hallway late at night, he'd feel a shiver run down his spine, a cold draft that seemed to come from nowhere. He told himself it was just the old building settling, the way old places tend to do. Then one night, while he was up late reading in the living room, he heard a faint sound coming from the hallway. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers against the wall. Sam's first thought was that a neighbor was moving around upstairs, but the noise seemed to grow louder, more insistent, coming closer to his apartment door. Sam put down his book and walked to the hallway. As he approached, the tapping stopped abruptly. He stood there for a moment, straining to hear anything else, but all he could sense was the silence pressing in on him. With a shake of his head, he turned and headed back to the living room, convinced it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But that was only the beginning. The next night, as Sam was brushing his teeth, he glanced into the hallway mirror and saw a shadow standing at the far end of the hall. It was tall and thin, almost humanoid but not quite. Its limbs seemed elongated, twisted, like they were stretching toward him. He blinked, and the shadow was gone, the hallway empty, as if nothing had been there. Sam's pulse quickened as he stared into the empty space. He told himself it was just a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by the streetlights outside. But the image of that figure, its unnatural shape, was burned into his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd seen something real, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Determined to prove that he was just being paranoid, Sam set up a small camera in the hallway that night, pointing it directly at where he had seen the shadow. He hit record and went to bed, trying to convince himself that he'd find nothing but an empty hallway in the morning. When he woke up, Sam hesitated before checking the camera. He took a deep breath and pressed play, watching the footage scroll by on fast forward. For hours, nothing happened. The hallway remained still, bathed in the soft glow of the nightlight. And then, just after 3 a.m., the camera picked up something, a movement, a flicker in the darkness. The shadow reappeared, this time closer to the camera, its form more distinct. Sam felt his breath hitch as he saw the figure step out of the darkness, its head tilting slightly, as if observing the camera. It didn't move like a person, it seemed to glide, its limbs bending in unnatural angles, like a puppet on invisible strings. And then it did something that made Sam's blood run cold. It turned to face the camera directly, and though it had no visible features, Sam could feel its gaze, like it was looking right at him through the screen, as if it knew he was watching. The camera suddenly cut to static, the screen filled with a burst of white noise, and when the image returned, the hallway was empty again. Sam stared at the screen, his hands shaking. He rewound the footage and played it again, over and over, but each time the figure vanished into the static, leaving him with more questions than answers. That night, Sam could hardly sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shadow in the hallway, the way it seemed to reach out to him, calling to him in silence. He lay in bed, listening to the creaks and groans of the old building, every sound amplified in the darkness. Around 3 a.m., he heard it again, the soft tapping sound coming from the hallway. Sam sat up, his heart pounding, and turned on the light. The tapping stopped immediately, but he could feel a presence, a coldness in the air that seemed to press against his skin. He got out of bed and opened the door to the hallway, and there it was. The shadow stood at the far end of the hall, its head tilted to one side, watching him. Sam's breath caught in his throat as the figure took a step toward him, and then another, its movements slow and deliberate. He backed away, his hands shaking, and slammed the bedroom door shut. He grabbed his phone and dialed his best friend, Mark, who knew about the strange occurrences in the apartment. "Mark, I need you to come over right now," Sam said, his voice trembling. "There's something in my hallway. I don't know what it is, but it's here." Mark arrived within minutes, finding Sam pale and shaken at the apartment door. Together, they stepped into the hallway, Mark holding a flashlight. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, revealing nothing but the empty corridor. The shadow was gone. "You sure you saw something?" Mark asked, though his voice carried a note of doubt. Sam nodded, his face set with determination. "I'm not crazy, Mark. I've got footage of it. There's something here, watching me. I can feel it." Mark looked skeptical but agreed to stay the night on the couch. They set up a series of cameras, all pointing down the hallway, determined to catch whatever was haunting Sam's apartment. They watched the live feed in silence, waiting for something, anything, to appear. Around 3:15 a.m., the room seemed to grow colder, a chill settling over them. And then, there was the shadow flickering into view at the end of the hallway. This time it didn't just stand there. It started to move, its limbs twisting, bending as it crept closer. Mark's eyes widened in disbelief. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. The figure moved to the nearest photograph on the wall, a picture of the building's original tenants, and touched it with one elongated finger. The glass cracked instantly, spiderwebbing across the surface, as the shadow's touch spread through the frame. Sam and Mark stared in horror as the shadow turned, and for the first time it spoke. A low, raspy whisper filled the air, words forming in a language neither of them understood. The hallway lights flickered, dimming to almost nothing, and the shadow seemed to grow, its form expanding, filling the space. "You have seen too much," it whispered, the voice sounding like it came from the walls themselves. "You are not welcome here." And just like that, the lights went out completely, plunging them into darkness. Sam felt a rush of cold air blast through the hallway, and when the lights flickered back on, the shadow was gone. The photographs on the wall had all shattered, their pieces littering the floor. Mark turned to Sam, his face pale and stunned. "We need to get out of here," he said. "Now." They grabbed what they could and bolted from the apartment, not stopping until they were outside in the crisp night air. Sam's mind raced as he tried to comprehend what had just happened. He knew that shadow wasn't just a ghost or a trick of the light, it was something far older, far darker. The next day, Sam decided to research the building's history. He discovered that it had once been a boarding house in the early 1900s, a place where people mysteriously vanished without a trace. The legend spoke of a figure known as the Watcher, an entity that dwelled in the hallways, feeding on the fear of those who lived there. The Watcher was said to be a guardian of the building's secrets, a sentinel that ensured the souls trapped within its walls never found peace. Those who saw the Watcher were marked, chosen to join the others lost in the building's endless corridors, never to be seen again. Sam moved out of the apartment that very week, but the memory of that night, the feeling of the Watcher's gaze upon him, never left. He could still see it sometimes, in the corner of his eye, in the darkened hallways of his new place. The tapping would start late at night, a reminder that he could never truly escape. And every time he looked into a mirror or a shadowed corner, he half expected to see it there, the Watcher, waiting, watching, ready to reclaim what belonged to it. Sam knew then that the Watcher wasn't bound to that old building. It had followed him, marked him, as one of its own. And no matter where he went, no matter how far he ran, it would always be there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for him to slip back into its grasp. Story 12, the clock that ticks backward, time moves against you. Elena had always been fascinated by antique shops, the kind that seemed to hold 1,000 secrets within their dusty shelves. One chilly afternoon, she wandered into a small, out-of-the-way store that she had never noticed before. The shop was packed with old furniture, faded books, and curiosities from another era. But what caught her eye was a peculiar clock, tucked away on a high shelf in the corner. It was a grandfather clock, tall and ornate, with a dark wooden frame and brass details that glinted in the dim light. The pendulum swayed back and forth, and its face was carved with delicate, intricate patterns. But what struck Alina as odd was the direction of its hands. They moved backward, ticking in reverse. Intrigued, she asked the shopkeeper about it. The old man's eyes seemed to darken slightly as he looked at the clock. "Ah, the timepiece that defies time," he said with a crooked smile. "It's said to be a rare piece, one that doesn't just tell the hours, it changes them. People say it's cursed, but I think of it more as misunderstood." Alina, always a skeptic, laughed off the idea of a cursed clock. She loved the strange and the unusual, and this clock seemed like the perfect addition to her apartment. Without hesitation, she bought it, unaware of the darkness she was bringing into her life. When she got home, she placed the clock in her living room, its presence adding a touch of old-world charm to the space. She wound it up, listening to the satisfying click of its gears, and watched as the hands continued their backward journey. For a while, the clock was just an interesting conversation piece, a quirky relic from the past. But then, the strangeness began. Elena first noticed it when she was getting ready for work. She checked the time on her phone. It was 7:45 a.m. She glanced at the clock, and to her surprise, it showed 7:15 a.m., the hands ticking steadily backward. She laughed, thinking it must be stuck or malfunctioning, and went on with her day. But as the days went by, she started noticing more than just the odd time on the clock. Moments in her life seemed to rewind. One evening, as she was making dinner, she accidentally knocked over a glass of water. She watched in shock as the water spilled across the counter, only for it to suddenly draw back into the glass, as though the moment had reversed itself. She blinked, staring at the dry countertop, wondering if she was losing her mind. The incidents became more frequent. She would drop her keys, only to watch them rise back into her hand. Conversations she'd had with friends would suddenly reset, as if she'd never said a word. Elena tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew it had something to do with the clock. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard an extra tick, slow and deliberate, echoing through the quiet apartment. It was different from the regular rhythm of the clock. She sat up, listening, and felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The sound seemed to pulse through the walls, a heartbeat of time moving in reverse. She got out of bed and walked into the living room, her eyes fixed on the clock. The hands moved faster now, spinning backward in a blur, the ticking sound growing louder, almost like whispers hidden beneath the beat. She reached out to touch the clock, and the moment her fingers brushed its surface, everything stopped. The room went silent, frozen in place. She pulled her hand back in shock, and as soon as she did, the world snapped back to life, but not quite as it had been. The furniture was slightly different, the lights dimmer, and the air felt heavy, as if the room was filled with a presence she couldn't see. Elena's mind raced. She felt as though she had stepped into a different version of her own apartment, a place that looked the same but felt fundamentally wrong. The clock stood there, its hands ticking backward in a steady, relentless rhythm, almost as if it were mocking her. She decided she needed to get rid of it. This clock was more than just an antique, it was a gateway to something beyond her understanding. The next morning, she packed it up and drove to the antique store, determined to return it. But when she got there, the shop was gone, vanished, as if it had never existed. Elena stood on the empty sidewalk, her hands trembling. She checked the address, certain she was in the right place, but there was nothing there. Just a vacant lot, overgrown with weeds, with no sign that a shop had ever stood there. She drove home in a daze, the clock still in her back seat, ticking louder now, each sound like a knife against her nerves. She didn't know what to do. Every time she thought about smashing it, breaking it to pieces, a sense of dread filled her, as if the clock itself was warning her not to. That night, the strangeness reached its peak. Elena sat in her living room, staring at the clock, determined to confront it once and for all. As she watched, the clock's hands began to move faster, the ticking growing louder and louder, until it sounded like a roar in her ears. The pendulum swung wildly, back and forth, casting shadows that twisted across the walls. Suddenly, the air around her seemed to ripple, and Elena felt herself pulled backward. It was as if time itself had snapped, yanking her out of the present. She found herself standing in her kitchen, holding the same glass of water she'd spilled days ago. But this time, the water didn't fall to the counter. It hovered in midair, droplets suspended like tiny orbs, before slowly moving back into the glass. She felt sick, like her whole body was being pulled inside out. Memories she'd forgotten flashed before her eyes in reverse, playing out scenes from her life like a film unwinding. Her childhood home, her first love, her heartbreaks, all flickering past her in quick succession. And then, to her horror, she saw things she didn't remember at all. Images of herself in different places, different times, standing in rooms she'd never been in, talking to people she didn't know. It was as if the clock wasn't just taking her back through her own past, but through lives she had never lived. She watched herself grow younger, her face smoothing out, her hair darkening, until she was a child again, then an infant, then nothing more than a thought on the edge of existence. Elena screamed, a sound that seemed to echo through the fabric of reality itself, and suddenly she was back in her living room, the clocks ticking, the only sound in the world. She was on her knees, gasping for breath, her hands clutching the floor. She looked up at the clock, and its hands were still moving, ticking backward at a steady pace. But now, she could see the truth. The face of the clock wasn't just a dial. It was an eye that watched her, unblinking, calculating. It was alive, and it was alive, and it was aware of her. She realized that the clock wasn't just measuring time, it was feeding on it, pulling moments from her life and consuming them. Desperate, Elena grabbed a hammer from her toolbox and swung it at the clock with all her strength. The hammer connected, and for a moment she felt resistance. But instead of shattering, the clock seemed to absorb the impact, rippling like water. A laugh, hollow and metallic, echoed from its depths. Futile, a voice whispered from within the clock, a sound that seemed to come from every corner of the room at once. Time cannot be destroyed, only consumed. The pendulum stopped swinging, and the hands of the clock reversed their direction, now moving forward at a terrifying speed. The room around her began to age, dust thickened on the surfaces, paint peeled from the walls, the lights flickered and went out. The world was moving on without her, dragging her into a future that was not her own. No, she screamed, as the clock's laughter grew louder. "You can't have me." And then, everything went silent. When she opened her eyes, she was standing in the empty apartment, the same apartment, but it wasn't hers anymore. The clock was gone. The furniture was covered in sheets, and the windows were boarded up. She heard voices outside, muffled conversations about the old place where the woman disappeared years ago. Elena ran to the door, but when she opened it, she found herself looking out into the same room she had just left, like a reflection, a loop that had no end. She was trapped, caught in the clock's endless game. No matter where she turned, the door always led her back to the same empty space. The last thing she saw, in the corner of the room, was a flash of brass, a new clock, identical to the one she had bought, ticking steadily backward. She realized then that she was no longer outside of time, but part of it, another memory caught within the gears of its impossible machine. And now, every time the clock ticks, it moves closer to the next person who dares to wind its gears, to touch its face, to believe. They can control time. But Elena will always be there, just a shadow within the clock's glass, watching, waiting, a prisoner of moments that will never truly belong to her again. Story 13, The Call from the Basement, Voices from Below. Sophie had never liked basements. Growing up, the one in her family home was always a place she avoided. It was dark, cold, and filled with old boxes and forgotten memories. So when she moved into her new house and saw the basement door in the hallway, a familiar unease crept over her. Still, she shrugged it off. It was just a basement, after all, nothing more. For the first few weeks, Sophie didn't think much about it. She kept the door closed and tried not to venture down there. Life in the new house was busy, and there were enough things to focus on without worrying about a dusty, unused room. But that all changed one evening when the phone rang. Sophie was in the living room, unpacking boxes, when she heard the faint ringing of a phone. It wasn't her cell phone, which lay silent on the table beside her. This ringing was coming from somewhere else, somewhere deep in the house. She followed the sound down the hallway, her ears straining to pinpoint its source. It was coming from the basement. Her stomach twisted as she stared at the basement door, the ringing growing louder, echoing up the stairs. Sophie hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She didn't have a landline in the house, just her cell phone. So what was ringing down there? Taking a deep breath, she opened the door. Cold air wafted up from the darkness below, carrying with it the faint, musty smell of earth and mold. The ringing continued, more insistent now, urging her to come closer. She grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the first step, then another, the wood creaking under her weight. As she descended into the darkness, the ringing became clearer, more tangible, like it was pulling her into its grip. She reached the bottom of the stairs and swung the flashlight beam across the room, revealing old furniture covered with dusty sheets, stacks of boxes, and a tangle of cobwebs. The sound was coming from a small, antique rotary phone sitting on a table in the far corner of the basement. Sophie stared at it in disbelief. The phone looked ancient, with a faded black casing and a heavy receiver. Its rotary dial was cracked, the numbers barely visible. She had never seen this phone before and had no idea how it got there. And yet, it was ringing. She reached out with a trembling hand, hesitating before finally picking up the receiver. The ringing stopped abruptly, replaced by a crackling silence that seemed to stretch on forever. "Hello," she said, her voice barely a whisper. There was no answer at first, just a faint static on the line. Then, a voice came through, soft and distant, as if speaking from the depths of a well. "Sophie," it said, and she felt a chill crawl up her spine. "Who is this?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. "You need to help me," the voice continued, ignoring her question. "I'm trapped. Please. You have to find me." Sophie's heart raced. The voice sounded familiar, like an echo of her own thoughts, yet distorted, twisted. "Who are you? Where are you trapped?" she asked, her voice shaking. But there was no response, just a burst of static, followed by the dull click of the line disconnecting. She stared at the phone in her hand, unable to comprehend what had just happened. She quickly hung up, turned on her heel, and fled back up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind her. She spent the rest of the evening trying to convince herself that it had all been a prank, some old wiring in the house picking up a random signal, maybe. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that the call was real, that someone or something was trying to reach out to her from the darkness below. The next few nights were restless. Sophie lay in bed, her mind filled with the sound of that ringing phone and the desperate voice on the other end. She avoided the basement at all costs, but she couldn't avoid the growing sense of dread that followed her through every room of the house. Then, just as she was starting to convince herself that it was all in her head, the phone rang again. It was late, well past midnight, when the familiar sound echoed through the quiet house. Sophie sat bolt upright in bed, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. The ringing came from the basement, louder this time, more urgent. She grabbed her flashlight and her phone, dialing her best friend Emma's number as she headed toward the door. "Emma," she said as soon as her friend picked up. "It's happening again. The phone is ringing in the basement." "Are you sure it's not just a dream?" Emma replied, her voice groggy with sleep. "No," Sophie insisted. "I'm wide awake, and it's real. I need you to come over. Please." "Okay, I'm on my way," Emma said, now fully alert. "Don't go down there until I get there." Sophie agreed, but as soon as she hung up, the ringing grew even louder, almost like a scream demanding her attention. She couldn't wait. She had to know who was on the other end. Before she could stop herself, she was at the basement door, opening it and descending the stairs once more. When she reached the bottom, the phone was already in her hand, the receiver cold against her skin. She lifted it to her ear, the static hissing like 1,000 whispers. "Hello," she said, her voice shaking. This time the voice was clearer, more intense, almost like a mirror of her own. "Sophie, please," it begged. "I'm you. I'm trapped down here. You have to help me before it's too late." "What do you mean?" "You're me," Sophie demanded, her mind reeling. "This is insane." "Listen," the voice said, urgent and trembling. "The basement is a doorway to something else. If you don't help me, you'll be next. Don't let it take you." Before Sophie could respond, the basement light flickered and then went out, plunging her into darkness. The temperature in the room plummeted, and she felt a presence cold, malevolent, something lurking just beyond her vision. The phone crackled again, but this time it wasn't her voice on the line. It was something else, something darker. A deep, hollow laughter filled the receiver, echoing through the basement. "You cannot escape," the new voice whispered, its tone mocking. "She is already lost. And now it's your turn." Sophie's breath hitched as she dropped the phone, the clatter echoing in the silence. She fumbled for her flashlight and turned it on, sweeping the beam across the room. There in the corner, she saw a shadow shifting, twisting, slowly forming into a figure that seemed to step out of the darkness itself. The shape moved toward her, its form undefined, like smoke trapped in the shape of a human, eyes glowing with an eerie light. Sophie stumbled back, her mind screaming to get away, to run. She turned and raced up the stairs, her feet pounding on the wood, each step echoing like a drumbeat. Just as she reached the top, the basement door slammed shut, trapping her hand between the frame and the door. She cried out in pain, yanking her hand free, and managed to throw the door open. She stumbled into the hallway just as Emma arrived, breathless and wide-eyed. "Sophie," Emma shouted, grabbing her by the shoulders. "What happened? Are you okay? The basement, Sophie gasped. There's something down there. It said it was me, but it's not. It's not me. Emma looked confused but resolute. We need to see this thing, she said. Whatever it is, we're going to face it together. Armed with flashlights and a heavy sense of dread, they descended the stairs once more. But when they reached the bottom, the basement was empty. The rotary phone sat silent on the table, the air still and cold, like a tomb. You sure you heard something? Emma asked, though her voice was now laced with doubt. Sophie stared at the phone, her mind spinning. It was here, she whispered. I swear, it was here. Just as they were about to leave, the phone rang again, sharper, louder than before. Emma jumped back, and Sophie's heart stopped. She reached out, hesitated for a moment, then picked up the receiver. But this time, there was no static, no voice, just a soft, rhythmic tapping, like something drumming against the phone's casing. And then the voice returned, faint and distant. It's too late, it said. You shouldn't have answered. Before they could react, the basement light flickered on and off, and the temperature dropped even further. The shadows on the wall began to move, coalescing into the shape of a figure that looked exactly like Sophie, only twisted, distorted, its face a mask of fear and anger. You didn't save me, the doppelganger hissed, its eyes burning with an unnatural light. Now you'll join me in the dark. The room plunged into darkness, and the only sound was the hum of the phone's dial tone, ringing louder and louder until it drowned out all thought. Sophie felt herself being pulled, dragged toward the shadowy figure, its arms outstretched, ready to consume her. And then, as quickly as it began, everything stopped. The lights flickered back on, and the basement was empty once more. The phone lay on the floor, silent. Emma reached out and shook Sophie, who seemed frozen in place, her eyes wide with terror. Let's get out of here, Emma whispered, and together they fled the basement, slamming the door shut behind them. Sophie moved out of the house the very next day, leaving the basement and its secrets behind. But even in her new apartment, she could still hear it sometimes, the faint ringing of a rotary phone, calling to her from some forgotten place below. And every time it rang, she knew the truth. The call from the basement was not just a cry for help. It was a warning, a curse, a reminder that somewhere in the darkness, another version of her was waiting to take her place. Story 14, the face in the window, eyes that never blink. Maggie had just moved into a small, quaint house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by trees and an eerie kind of quiet that was a far cry from the noise of the city. She thought it would be a peaceful place to focus on her writing, a place where inspiration could find her without distractions. But her first night in the new house, she began to feel that the silence held secrets. The living room had large windows that looked out onto the front yard. Maggie loved the idea of natural light flooding in during the day, but at night, those windows took on a different character. The darkness outside seemed to press against the glass, and it was impossible to see anything beyond her own reflection. On her first evening, as she was unpacking a box of books, Maggie caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye. A face, pale, gaunt, staring at her from the window. She gasped, turning quickly to get a better look, but saw only her own reflection and the darkness beyond. She told herself it was just a trick of the light, the result of exhaustion from the long day of unpacking. But that image of the face wouldn't leave her mind. It lingered in her thoughts like a shadow creeping into the corners of her consciousness, even when she tried to forget. The following night, Maggie sat at her desk, typing away on her laptop, the glow of the screen casting a soft light around her. The windows were a black mirror, and she tried not to look at them, telling herself that it was silly to be afraid of something that wasn't there. But then she saw it again. The face was back, clearer this time, pressed against the window like it was trying to peer inside. Its eyes were wide, too wide, and its mouth was slightly open, like it was on the verge of whispering something. Maggie's heart jumped into her throat as she spun around in her chair, only to find the window empty once more. She jumped to her feet, rushing to turn on all the lights in the house. She closed the curtains, every one of them, and tried to convince herself that she was just tired, that her eyes were playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the truth. The face she'd seen was too real, too vivid to be a figment of her imagination. Over the next few days, the sightings became more frequent. Each night, no matter how tightly she closed the curtains or how many lights she turned on, Maggie would catch glimpses of the face in the window. Sometimes it was watching her from the kitchen window, sometimes from the living room. Always the same face, pale, expressionless, with those eyes that never blinked. Desperate for answers, Maggie called her friend Jess, who was always the rational one in their group. "You're just stressed," Jess said over the phone. "Moving is a big deal, and it can mess with your head. How about I come over and we can check it out together?" Maggie agreed, and the next evening, Jess showed up with a flashlight and a determined look on her face. They went around the house, checking the windows, looking for any sign of someone lurking outside. They found nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the breeze and the sound of leaves rustling in the darkness. "See? There's no one out there," Jess said, trying to sound convincing. "It's probably just the reflection of your own face. Sometimes when it's dark outside and you're lit up inside, your brain can play tricks on you." Maggie nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As they settled in for the night, Jess made light of the situation, telling funny stories to ease the tension. Maggie almost started to believe her friend that maybe it was all in her head. But then, just as they were about to call it a night, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, the sudden silence almost deafening. Maggie's heart raced as she reached for her flashlight, the beam shaking slightly in her trembling hand. Jess stood still, staring toward the window. "Maggie," Jess whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't move." Maggie followed her gaze to the window and felt her blood turn to ice. The face was there, pressed right against the glass. Only this time, it wasn't just a face, it was a whole figure. A gaunt, shadowy figure with eyes like black voids staring in at them. Its mouth opened, revealing a wide, hollow grin, and it raised one skeletal hand to the glass. The figure didn't move like a person. It seemed to flicker, like an image on a glitchy screen, shifting in and out of focus, yet its eyes never left Maggie's. Jess stumbled backward, knocking over a chair, her face pale with terror. "What the hell is that?" Jess gasped, barely able to get the words out. Maggie couldn't answer. She felt like the figure was pulling her in, its eyes locking onto hers, dragging her deeper into the darkness that seemed to surround it. Then, just as suddenly, the power came back on. The lights flickered to life, and the figure vanished. They both stood there, shaking, staring at the empty window. Jess grabbed her phone, hands trembling as she dialed the police. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice cracking. "Now." They fled the house and waited outside on the cold driveway until the police arrived. The officers searched the entire property, checked the yard, and even looked through the nearby woods. They found no sign of anyone, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there. "It could have been a trespasser," one of the officers said, though he sounded doubtful. "Or a trick of the light, maybe a reflection from inside." Maggie and Jess knew what they'd seen, but no amount of explaining would make the officers believe them. After the police left, Jess insisted on staying the night, but Maggie couldn't relax. She kept seeing that face every time she closed her eyes, that grin that seemed to taunt her from the other side of the window. As the hours passed and Jess finally fell asleep on the couch, Maggie stayed awake, staring at the window. The house was quiet, too quiet, and the silence felt like a living thing, pressing in on her from all sides. And then, at around 3 a.m., she heard a soft tapping on the glass. She turned her head slowly, dread pooling in her stomach. The face was back, but this time it was closer than ever, pressed against the glass with its hollow eyes fixed on her. Maggie felt a scream rise in her throat, but it caught there, trapped by the terror that froze her in place. The face mouthed something, a single word that fogged the glass. "Come dot." Maggie shook her head, backing away slowly. But the figure's eyes followed her every move, and its grin widened, as if it knew a secret she could never understand. She grabbed her phone, aimed its flashlight at the window, and for a moment the light revealed something horrifying. The figure wasn't outside. It was inside the glass itself, like a twisted reflection trapped within the window pane, its face pressed against the other side of reality. Its hand reached out, its fingers splayed against the glass, as though it was trying to break through. With trembling hands, Maggie yanked the curtains closed, but it didn't matter. She could still feel the thing watching her, could almost hear its breath against the glass, whispering her name over and over. She tried to wake Jess, shaking her by the shoulders. "Jess, wake up," Maggie shouted. "We have to leave. Now." Jess woke up groggy and confused, but when she saw the panic in Maggie's eyes, she didn't hesitate. They grabbed their things and ran out of the house into the night. Maggie refused to look back at the windows, afraid of what she might see staring back at her. They stayed at a motel for the rest of the night, huddled together, not saying a word. Maggie's mind raced with thoughts of the face in the window, the way it seemed to live inside the glass. She knew now that it wasn't just an intruder or a trick of the light. The next day, they went back to the house in broad daylight. Maggie's heart sank when she saw that every window had cracked from the inside, tiny fractures spider-webbing across the glass, as if something had tried to force its way through. She moved out of the house that week, unable to bear the thought of living there another day. But even after she settled into a new place, she couldn't escape the feeling that the face was still watching her. Every time she passed a window or looked into a mirror, she saw the faint outline of those hollow eyes, waiting for her to look just a little too closely. And then one night, as she was getting ready for bed, she heard it again, the soft tapping, this time on her bedroom window. She turned slowly, heart pounding, and there it was. The face grinning back at her, its eyes gleaming in the dark. It whispered her name, a sound like wind through broken glass. Come Dot. And she knew then that the face in the window wasn't just trapped, it was waiting. And it would. Never stop until it found a way to pull her through. Story 15, The Whisper Under the Bed, Secrets Beneath the Silence. Katie had always considered herself too old to be afraid of the dark. At 28, she had outgrown the childhood fears of monsters lurking in closets or under the bed. But when she moved into her new apartment, a tiny one-bedroom place on the edge of the city, those old fears began to creep back in. The first few nights were normal enough. Katie unpacked her boxes, set up her furniture, and slowly began to settle in. The place was quiet, almost too quiet, with only the occasional creak of the old wooden floors to break the silence. But that stillness brought with it a sense of unease that Katie couldn't shake. One night, as she lay in bed trying to fall asleep, she heard a faint, almost inaudible whisper coming from somewhere below her. She froze, holding her breath, straining her ears to catch the sound again. There it was, soft and slow, like a voice speaking in hushed tones right under her bed. Katie sat up, her eyes wide with alarm. She listened carefully, but the whispering stopped the moment she moved. She reached for her bedside lamp, turning it on, flooding the room with light. She glanced around, her heart racing, but everything looked perfectly normal. She got out of bed and knelt down, peering into the darkness beneath her bed frame. All she could see were a few boxes of books and some old clothes she hadn't found a place for yet, nothing out of the ordinary. Telling herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her, she climbed back into bed and turned off the light. But as soon as the room was dark again, the whispering returned. This time it was clearer, closer. A soft voice speaking words she couldn't quite understand, like a chant or a lullaby sung in reverse. Katie's skin prickled with goosebumps. She turned on the light once more, and just as before, the whispering stopped, leaving her alone in the silence. Katie didn't sleep much that night. She lay awake, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, trying to convince herself that it was just the house settling, or the wind outside, or maybe even a neighbor's TV set turned too low. Anything but the idea that someone or something was under her bed, whispering to her in the dark. The next morning, after a restless night, she decided to talk to her friend Carla about it. Carla was the practical type, the kind of person who didn't believe in ghosts or things that go bump in the night. "You're just stressed," Carla said when they met for coffee. "New place, different noises. Old buildings make sounds you're not used to. It's probably nothing." Katie nodded, trying to believe her friend's rational explanation. But that night, when she lay down in bed and turned off the light, the whispering came back louder, clearer, more insistent. She could almost make out words this time, fragments of sentences that seemed to echo in her mind. "Come." Closer the voice whispered, so softly that it was almost like a breeze brushing against her ear. "I'm waiting." Katie's blood turned to ice. She lay still, her muscles tense, staring into the darkness, too afraid to move. The voice was so close, it felt like whoever was speaking was just inches away from her face. Summoning all her courage, Katie jumped out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and pointed it at the floor. She knelt down slowly, lifting the dust ruffle that hung down from the mattress, and shone the light into the darkness beneath her bed. The beam illuminated nothing but the old boxes, a few stray socks, and the cold wooden floor. There was no sign of anyone or anything hiding there. She let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she tried to steady the flashlight. But just as she was about to turn away, she heard it again this time, directly in her ear. "Don't leave me alone down here," the voice said, clear and pleading. Katie stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, her heart racing. The whisper had been so real, so close, that she could almost feel the breath on her skin. She ran to the living room, turned on every light in the apartment, and grabbed her phone. She didn't know who to call or what to say, but she knew she couldn't stay in the bedroom, not after what she had just heard. Desperate for answers, she reached out to the landlord the next morning, asking if he knew anything strange about the apartment's history. "It's an old building," the landlord said dismissively. "Settles a lot at night. Sometimes you'll hear creaks and groans, but that's normal. Haven't had any complaints from the last tenant." Katie pressed for more details, but the landlord seemed reluctant to say much else. The last tenant left pretty quickly, he admitted. Said she was moving for a job. But you know, people come and go all the time in this business. Feeling frustrated and unnerved, Katie decided to do some digging on her own. She searched online for any information she could find about the apartment, looking up old records, news articles, anything that might explain the strange occurrences. And then, buried in the archives of a local news website, she found something that made her blood run cold. The apartment had been the scene of a disappearance nearly 10 years ago. A woman named Lydia Collins had lived there, and one night, she simply vanished without a trace. Her belongings were left untouched, her front door locked from the inside. The only clue was a chilling note scrawled on a piece of paper left on her bed, "Don't let them take me under." Katie's hands shook as she stared at the words on the screen. She felt a growing sense of dread, a fear that tightened around her like a vice. She knew then that the whispers weren't just her imagination, and that they were connected to Lydia's disappearance. That night, as Katie lay in bed, she didn't bother turning off the light. She knew the whisper would come, whether the room was dark or not. And it did, softer this time, almost like a sigh, a whisper from another world. "Help me," the voice said, barely audible. "Please, don't leave me down here." Katie's fear turned to determination. She grabbed her flashlight and, with a deep breath, slowly crouched down to look under the bed once more. This time she reached out, moving the boxes aside, her fingers trembling as she brushed against the cold floor. And then she saw it. A small, hollow space carved into the floorboards, just big enough for a hand to reach through. Her flashlight flickered, and for a split second she saw something else's fingers, pale and thin, gripping the edge of the hole. Katie's breath caught in her throat as a face emerged from the darkness beneath the bed. It was the face of a woman, gaunt, terrified, her eyes wide and pleading. Her lips cracked and dry as she mouthed the words, "Don't let them take me back." Katie screamed and scrambled away, her flashlight rolling across the floor. The woman's face, Lydia's face, twisted into an expression of horror, and then she was gone, sucked back into the darkness beneath the bed. Katie slammed her bedroom door shut and called the police, her voice shaking as she told them about the hidden space under the bed, about the face she had seen. They arrived within minutes, searching the apartment, pulling up floorboards, tearing apart the room. They found nothing. No hidden space, no evidence of anyone under the bed, just dust and old wood. The officer in charge gave her a sympathetic look, suggesting that maybe she'd experienced a vivid dream or sleep paralysis, but Katie knew the truth. She knew that Lydia Collins was still down there, trapped in a place that wasn't quite of this world, and whatever had taken her was still waiting, hiding in the shadows, whispering to her through the darkness. Katie moved out of the apartment the very next day, refusing to spend another night in that cursed place. But even in her new home, she couldn't escape the whispers. She would hear them in the dead of night, just as she was drifting off to sleep, a soft voice calling to her from beneath the bed. "Don't leave me," the whisper said. "I'm still here, waiting." And she knew then that no matter where she went, she would never truly escape the voice under the bed. It would always follow her, always whisper to her, always remind her that there are things in the dark that you can't just walk away from. Things that never stop watching. Things that never stop waiting.